Chapter 450. GOR Chapter 426. Time. This year's winter brought together all the interesting events that could be found in history. Wars, conspiracies, overt plots, the change of the throne, the fall of an empire or even its overthrow, the struggle between various forces, the rise of a new force, the emergence of a new powerhouse on the world's stage. History tells us that if all these things happened in the same period of time, then the only result would be the birth of a huge revolution. Shea's face was completely numb from the cold wind. He could not even feel the pain brought about by the bone-piercing cold wind. Riding on horseback, he felt as though his body was about to fall apart from the bumpy ride of the past few days. He could only use a rope to tie himself to the horse's back and grit his teeth as he pressed on. They set out from Husker City and headed north to Denzel City. They had to pass through Assyria County and Ilton County before finally arriving at Moore County. Ilton County was still in the hands of Odin's men. For Shea's small cavalry group, this journey was fraught with danger. In order to ensure Shea's safety, the governor's wife of the Besta military region had sent out her elite guards. After entering the territory of Ilton County, the group sped up even more. They rode day and night without stopping, striving to cross the enemy's territory as soon as possible. Shea could not take it anymore. For the first time, he felt a deep sense of hatred for his current physical condition. This helpless hatred caused him to be unable to restrain himself from blaming Merlin for it. In the past, Shea, whose body was so strong that it was almost abnormal, would not be in such a sorry state. Along the way, Shea could clearly sense that the Besta military region's cavalry guards, who were in charge of escorting him, were looking at him with disdain. It was as though they were disdainful of his unbearable state. The cavalrymen sat on horseback and proudly shuttled back and forth around Shea. Although they were still exhausted, they had enough strength to show their pride. Shea had no choice but to tie himself to the back of the horse to prevent himself from falling behind. For a country bumpkin who had always been known for his bravery, it was a humiliation to be flaunted in front of him by a few mediocre cavalrymen. Fortunately, Shea's bad luck didn't follow him this time. After entering Ilton County, they did not encounter Odin's army and were not discovered by Odin's people, which minimized the risk. According to Shea's analysis, this was most likely because the main forces of Odin's army were still in the Corsica military region, cleaning up the remaining resistance forces and small groups of rebels. According to the schedule, they would have to wait for at least 2 days before they could pass through Ilton County and enter the borders of Moore County. Just last night, a blizzard hit. This was the first snow of the year. It came so early and so fiercely. The blizzard lasted for an entire night, accompanied by the howling cold wind, making it difficult for them to stand. The group had no choice but to stop and rest for the night in a forest. When the sun rose, the snow stopped falling slightly. Looking around, the wilderness was already silvery white. The thick snow painted the ground the same color, and there was no longer any distinction between the two. The road was covered by snow, and they couldn't see the road clearly. In this kind of weather, Odin's patrols should rarely go out, but it also made it more difficult for them to hurry on the road. In the forest, the guards were still tidying up the horses. The guards of the Besta military region were wrapping the horses' hooves with cotton cloth. Shea naturally didn't have to do these things himself. He stood outside the forest and looked into the distance, his face extremely gloomy. Damn it, it seems that God isn't willing to help Lao Tzu this time. The country bumpkin was so angry that he wanted to roar at the sky. Behind him, the sound of footsteps stepping on the snow could be heard. Shea turned around and saw Sogol, the former general of the Corsica military region whom he had subdued, standing behind him. Sogol was still thin. The constant running around made him look even more haggard. His body was wrapped in thick bandages, and he wore a leather hat on his head, making him look somewhat ridiculous. However, his back was still straight. This was one of the reasons why Shea found him pleasing to the eye. This fellow was indeed a man. You don't seem to be in a good mood. Sogol's voice was somewhat hoarse. Shea nodded and glanced at Sogol. I can't be happy. Look at this damned snow, it came too early, too early. It is only the end of November. Indeed, this year's snow came too early. Sogol exhaled white air from his mouth, his pair of thick eyebrows knitted together. This year's weather is too abnormal. There is more rain in summer than in previous years. Winter snow also came so early. Shea smiled bitterly. Forgive me for speaking bluntly. Sogol said indifferently. The rainy season in summer, the heavy rain for months, brought you good luck. If not for the month-long rainy season blocking the roads and information, Manninger would have set his sights on Moore County long ago. That continuous speech gave you the best opportunity to take a breather. I admit. Shea stroked his chin. However, this snow is not good news for me. Sogol was startled. This general pondered for a moment. Finally, as expected of an outstanding soldier of the Corsica military region, his expression immediately changed. He looked at Shea with a look of disbelief. Could it be you plan to launch a military operation against Manninger during winter? Shea smiled. His smile was somewhat helpless, but he did not deny it. This is too crazy, Sogol said in a serious tone. Although no one wants to attack the Odin people more than I do and subdue the Corsica military region as soon as possible, to attack the Odin people during winter is too bad. It can't be worse. It's stupid and reckless. Sogol looked at Shea. Seeing that Shea still did not speak, the general thought for a moment and felt that it was necessary to remind his new boss. He coughed and quickly said, The Odin people are all from the north. For us Byzantium people, the cold of winter is unbearable. However, for the Odin people, this is the climate they are most used to. In this climate, the Odin people are more adapted to it than us. Their fighting strength will not be affected much by the cold. However, our soldiers will be at a great disadvantage when fighting in the snow. After a pause, he continued while thinking. When fighting in the snow, the mobility of the cavalry will be reduced to the minimum. The traces of our army cannot be concealed on the snow. The hunters of the Odin people can easily find traces of our army on the snow. Our advantage will be weakened. Moreover, when the two armies fight, the thick snow will reduce the impact of our cavalry by at least 30%. The Odin people are mainly infantrymen, so they will not be affected by this. Also, Shea finally opened his mouth. He sighed and interrupted Sogol. What you said, I understand. Sogol looked at Shea and finally closed his mouth. He understood that this new boss and superior in front of him was not an idiot in military matters. At the very least, although this person's experience was not very deep, he had experienced several wars and his winning rate was quite good. There was no way he wouldn't understand such a simple logic. As a surrendered general and a newcomer, if he said too much, he was afraid that he would hurt this person's face and self-esteem. I have my reasons, and these reasons are sufficient. Shea smiled bitterly. He understood Sogol's worries, but he had no choice. He really had no choice. Ever since the day he left Husk City, when he said goodbye in the woods, the governor's wife had told him the shocking news. Along the way, Shea's heart had never calmed down. Osgilla! Osgilla! Damn that Osgilla! How could such a majestic city like the imperial capital be breached so easily? How could such a majestic city with tens of thousands of elite soldiers and a general like Adrik guarding it and the supply line of the Lantis army fall so easily? Not to mention, the situation had taken a huge turn for the better. The rebel army had entered a state of internal and external troubles and was gradually falling into a disadvantageous position. The fall of Osgilla brought about a series of chain reactions. Shea did not even want to think about it. Once the imperial family was destroyed, it would mean the end of the Byzantine Empire. Once the empire was destroyed, Shea's status as an imperial official would lose its legitimacy. The morale of his army would fall apart. His army, his officers, his generals, his entire organization would become a tree without roots. This year, although Shea had quickly accumulated some of his family's assets and strength, he had a huge flaw. The time he had spent in the army was too short, and the time he had spent on this stage was also too short. Although he had gathered more than 20,000 soldiers under his command, and they were of decent quality and possessed a certain amount of territory, it must be said that the loyalty of most of these soldiers and officers was built upon their loyalty to the empire. The loyalty of the majority of this organization was not towards Shea, but the empire. If Shea was given a few years, or even 1 or 2 more years, to slowly win over the hearts of the people and establish enough prestige, the loyalty of his subordinates would gradually shift to him. If he could turn the loyalty of this organization to Shea himself, then the situation would be much better. But now, Shea was certain that if the Byzantine Empire was truly destroyed, then this army under his command would dissipate by more than half within a day. Along the way, the only thing Shea prayed in his heart was that the Garcia Emperor would be lucky enough to break through the siege and escape. He did not care about the survival of the Byzantine Empire. Even unlike Adrik and the rest in Osgilla, Shea hoped that the emperor would be able to escape, regardless of the form. Even if the emperor ran to the Lantis ship and became a puppet of the Lantis, it would not affect Shea much. However, the emperor must not die. He must not allow the banner of the Byzantine Empire to fall. Shea needed this banner. He needed this empire in name, this emperor in name. Rushing day and night without stopping, nearly half of the horses had died, but Shea still ordered them not to rest. This order made the accompanying guards of the Besta military district very dissatisfied. They were all laughing at this seemingly majestic Sir Shea. This guy was the one who gave the order to madly rush, but the first one who could not hold on was himself. He could only tie himself to the back of a horse. This was simply a madman, and an incompetent madman at that. After running for a while, Shea's mind turned over and over again. He realized that there was only one feasible path in front of him. Start a war. Start a war immediately, start a war against the Odin. He did not have the time to continue waiting, to continue accumulating strength, to continue waiting for the best opportunity. The news of Osgilla's fall had not yet spread. At least, it would not spread to Moore County for the time being. It would not spread to his own army. He had to immediately start a war. While the morale of his army was still stable, he had to attack the enemy at all costs. He had to use this method to improve the morale of his army and internal cohesion. Using external war to strengthen internal cohesion. This method seemed very old and cliché, but he had to admit that this old method had always been very effective. Shea needed a victory against the Odin to improve the morale of his army. At the same time, he also needed to improve his personal prestige. With a victory against external war, he could establish the respect and worship of his own people. Although there were all kinds of drawbacks to starting a war in winter, Shea had no choice at this moment. He really had no choice. This was a gamble, and a very dangerous one. Manninger's Scarlet Snow Army was considered an elite army in the Odin Empire. They had just experienced a great victory against the Corsica military district. Their morale was high, and they were good at fighting in winter. If he launched a hasty attack, it was equivalent to gambling everything. If he failed, this small group that he had painstakingly built would become like snow under the sun, quickly melting and disintegrating. At least, we're not without advantages. Shea muttered to himself. His tone sounded like he was trying to convince Sagar or to comfort himself. In terms of food reserves, the Odin's people definitely don't have enough. We've been through almost half a year of preparation from summer until now. Odin's people fought a war against Corsica, so their food reserves must have been greatly depleted. Moreover, the Odin's people don't do production. They occupied Ilton County for half a year, but they didn't produce much food. The Corsica military district had just been occupied by them not long ago, and the flames of war spread everywhere. Although the Odin's people won, they definitely didn't get much food. No matter how strong a warrior is, they can't fight on an empty stomach. They may seem strong now, but they're just an empty shell. Moreover, once I launch an attack, the best people in the south will help us. Even if they won't really participate in the war, they can mobilize their troops to attract the attention of the Odin's people, and also distract Manning. If we can defeat them in one fell swoop, maybe. Shea glanced at Sagar again. Sagar's eyes were still puzzled. He sighed and didn't continue to explain. He didn't tell Sagar about the news of Osgila's fall. This news couldn't be told to anyone before he returned to Denzel City. Moreover, it wasn't as if he didn't have anything to rely on. At least, he still had a few secret tricks up his sleeve. Once he used them, they would still be quite useful. Time. This damned god really didn't give Lao Tzu a chance to catch his breath. Go up! Go up! Hughes roared at the top of his lungs. He waved his long sword with all his might. His eyes were bloodshot and his eyeballs were bloodshot. He yelled and jumped at the generals and officers around him. In his rage, he even raised his leg and kicked fiercely. The square in front of the palace was already full of corpses. Arrows were stuck into the ground like a wheat field. The outer walls of the palace castle were full of debris, and there were many places with traces of fire. Countless rebel soldiers charged forward like a tidal wave after the sound of the bugle horn. They carried ladders and shields and then retreated like a tidal wave amidst the battle cries. The eagle-headed flag of Byzantium on the castle of the royal palace was still standing. The battle for the palace had been going on for 3 days. The determination of the remaining defenders in the palace to resist had greatly exceeded the expectations of the rebel army. Logically speaking, after being trapped in Osgila for such a long time, the defenders should have quickly collapsed once the city was breached. However, the attack on the palace had caused the rebel army to lose a few teeth on the first day. The thousands of defenders in the palace, and even General Span personally, went up to the walls to fight. They repelled wave after wave of attacks from the rebel army. The number of corpses piled up on the walls of the palace had reached nearly 2,000 on the first day. In the beginning, the reason why the rebels were so fearless and dared to attack the royal palace was because of the benefits that their commanders promised them. Also, it was rumored that the royal palace contained the wealth that was accumulated by the emperors of the Byzantine Empire. However, in a situation where countless lives were sacrificed without any progress, the rebel army's morale fell so fast that even Hughes could do nothing about it. Almost all the rebel army was unwilling to go up and gnaw on this hard bone. Anyway, the city of Osgila had already been breached. There were large areas of land in the city. There were so many rich aristocrats' manors and properties that they could rob. There were so many shops and warehouses in the streets that the rich could loot. Seeing that a large sum of money was in front of them, they had fought so hard for nothing more than this moment. Rather than going to the palace to kill the emperor and snatch away his honor, they might as well take advantage of the chaos in the city and try their best to obtain more benefits. Almost none of the rebel soldiers were willing to fight to the death. They were all fighting and retreating. When they heard the bugle horn to attack, their shouts shook the heavens, but they were all bark and no bite. When they heard the bugle horn to retreat, they ran faster than anyone else. Most of the rebel army had already entered the city. As the #1 city in the continent, Osgila had many territories within the city and many of the rich aristocrats' manors. All of them became places for the rebel army to make a fortune. The streets were sealed off and the rebel army swarmed in like ants, setting fire and looting everywhere. One by one, the rich aristocrats' manors were caught in a sea of fire and looted. Disorderly soldiers were running back and forth within the city. Some of them were carrying the money and gold and silver utensils they had looted. Some of them were carrying young women they had kidnapped from who knows where. Everywhere they went, there were cries of pain and flames. The rebel army even began to openly divide the territories they had looted. Some of the rebel army even had small-scale fights and conflicts in order to fight for territory. The rebel army that entered the city belonged to dozens of different military regions. Faced with such a colorful world like Osgilla, almost everyone's eyes were red with killing intent. Everyone had fought with their lives on the line for more than half a year. Wasn't it all for this day? At this time, no one was willing to act modestly. Almost half of the rebel army that entered the city had spread out to loot everywhere. This situation made Hughes and Salvador so angry that they almost vomited blood. Although they had repeatedly ordered the various military regions to send troops to attack the palace, under the resolute resistance of the palace, no one was willing to lose their strength at this last moment. Despite Hughes and Salvatore's repeated orders, the families only pretended to comply. Although Hughes had ordered his army to attack the palace with all their might, even his own army's morale was somewhat scattered. When they entered the city, he had promised that after the city was breached, he would not put away his sword for 3 days and let his troops loot to their heart's content. This promise had once greatly boosted the army's morale. However, after entering the city, they saw that the other rebel armies were looting while their own Governor Hughes ordered everyone to attack the palace and continue to kill people. How many people in his army still had the will to fight? Seeing that everyone else was making a fortune, everyone's hearts were already wavering. They were afraid that if they were a day late, this colorful world would have been looted clean by others. They had fought for more than half a year. If they didn't get anything in the end, that would be the end of it. Everyone's hearts wavered. Many people were even dissatisfied with Hughes's strict orders. Salvador's troops were even worse. On the night that the city was breached, Salvador's troops attacked at the Arc de Triomphe. They did not hesitate to sacrifice themselves and attracted the attention of the defenders, resulting in heavy casualties. After entering the city, his subordinates also had the same thoughts. They only thought that it was time to reap the benefits. At this time, if they were forced to continue fighting, not many people would be willing to do so. The attack on the palace was not successful. The thousands of soldiers guarding the palace actually held on for 3 days. Salvador and Hughes repeatedly sent people to mobilize the other rebel armies. However, the generals of the various rebel armies only cared about firmly holding on to their own territories and looting the prosperous world of the imperial capital. Hughes and Salvador made threats and promises, but they only sent 300 to 500 people each. The people who were sent complained incessantly and were not willing to work hard. When the entire rebel army was attacking Osgilla, they were still able to show a bit of sincerity and unity. However, they did not expect to become like this once they entered the city. The only ones who remained clear-headed were Hughes and Salvador. The two of them divided the work. Salvador was responsible for clearing out the remaining troops guarding the Arc de Triomphe and Adric's troops, while Hughes was responsible for attacking the palace. However, after 3 days, Hughes and Salvador suffered heavy casualties. Salvador was even worse. His elite troops had suffered heavy casualties on the day of the siege. When they were dealing with Adric's remaining troops, not only were they unable to break through Adric's camp, but they were also beautifully counterattacked by Adric's troops twice. His troops were defeated and retreated 2 street. Salvador himself was caught off guard and almost died in the army. He only managed to escape with his life thanks to the protection of a group of his personal guards. After gathering the troops and attacking again, his subordinates were not willing to risk their lives. Hughes was so regretful that his intestines were turning green. Now, he only hated that he didn't continue to take the risk to charge straight into the palace on the night the city was breached. If he was willing to take the risk at that time, perhaps he could have seized this damned palace in one go. At this moment, in the entire Osgilla city, Only the palace and the Arc de Triomphe were still in the control of the Empire. The city was filled with rebels who were looting everywhere. Only the residences of the nobles who had secretly sided with the rebel army were safe. Hughes had done his job well, and did not break his promise. He had sent hundreds of soldiers to protect the residences of the nobles who had spies. When the rebels from other families came here to loot, they dispersed when they saw that Hughes' subordinates were guarding the place. Other than that, there was a special place in Osgilla City. Even though the city was in chaos, it miraculously maintained a rare tranquility. The entire street was silent. At the intersection, there were hundreds of rebel soldiers from different military regions. They were all fully armed and were guarding the intersection. Once any rebels came here, they would be chased away. The streets were unbelievably quiet. Even the rebel soldiers standing guard at the intersection deliberately walked back and forth with light footstep. They had all received strict orders. No one was allowed to take half a step into this street. No one was allowed to disturb the residents at the end of this street. In the past 3 days, the various rebel leaders, generals, commanders, and even some military governors had personally come here. They only brought a small number of guards with them. They dismounted from their horses far away at the intersection and handed their weapons to the people beside them. They put on a respectful look and walked across the street to the residence at the end of the street. They respectfully knocked on the door and asked for an audience. However, these generals and governors, even though the entire Osgilla city was in their hands and their lives were in their hands, they still seemed to show sufficient respect to this residence. Every time they came to visit, the other party would only send an old servant and only open the door halfway. They would then casually say a few words and shut the door in the face of these generals and governors. However, no one dared to act rashly here. Even though they were refused entry, the leaders of the rebel army all politely bid farewell and left. They even sent more men to protect the place. This was because the master of this house had a very high status in the eyes of the rebel army leaders. They had no choice but to respect the master of this house. Even the fiercest rebel had to act respectfully and courteously in front of the owner of this residence, regardless of whether they were willing or not. This was because the owner of this residence had too much prestige in the entire Byzantine Empire's army. It was so high that almost no one could ignore it. Among the dozens of rebel armies in the empire, many of the generals and even the governors were once his students or disciples, and some of them even served under his command. The residence of the Duke of Minas, the most respected elder in the Byzantine Empire's army and the most respected rebel army, still maintained the last bit of peace in this chaotic Osgilla city. At this moment, on the balcony of a small building in this mansion, a silver-haired old man was standing in the cold wind, looking at the city of Osgilla. He was wrapped in a thick leather robe, standing in the cold wind, looking at the city of Osgilla. Along with the sound of the wind, there were cries and shouts from all over the city. As far as the eye could see, there were black flames everywhere. The old duke's face looked calm, but his eyes were filled with pain. His hands were tightly gripping the railing. His fingers were trembling slightly. Millennium Imperial Capital. Millennium Imperial Capital. The Duke of Minas muttered to himself and gently shook his head. He turned around and saw 3 figures behind him. The young Rodi, the successor of the Duke, had a face full of anger. He gritted his teeth as he stared at the flames in the distance. Beside Rodi were 2 other figures. They were both women. The one with purple hair and purple eyes was Vaya. His face was covered with a cold iron mask. Half of his face was exposed as if it was covered with a layer of frost that would not melt for 1,000 years. He did not have the slightest expression. Beside Vaya was the young girl with freckles. She was Cavashir's youngest disciple. She was wearing a thin white robe. However, in the cold wind, the girl did not seem to feel cold at all. Rodi and Vaya were standing there, but the girl was sitting on a chair. Her expression was calm and she was holding a book in her hand. Amidst the sound of the wind and the sounds of fighting, the girl narrowed her eyes and focused on the book in her hand. Occasionally, she would flip through the pages. She did not look like she was in the middle of a war. Instead, she looked like she was sitting in her own backyard during peaceful times. The Duke of Minas stood in front of the fence for half an hour. The young girl in white had been reading for half an hour. When she finally flipped through the last page, she let out a sigh of relief and looked up with a gentle smile. In this chaos, only Your Excellency the Duke's house can obtain such peace. For the past few days, this is the only time I can read with peace of mind. Duke Minas glanced at the young girl and furrowed his brows. The girl's calmness really displeased the old man. There was no other reason other than the fact that the girl's demeanor was too similar to that of the deceased Cavalier. Did your teacher really not leave behind any other methods? The Duke of Minas took a deep breath and pointed at the city in the distance. Did that old man not expect such chaos? The girl gently put down the book in her hand and looked at the old Duke. She then smiled. Her tone was as calm as an ancient well. There was not a single ripple. Your Excellency the Duke, we have already done what we should do. The current situation is not something we can change with our individual abilities. His teacher had once said that even a god couldn't guarantee that every decision he made was correct. I have already done everything that teacher told me to do. Now all we can do is wait. Compared to this world and this empire, I am just an insignificant ant. Right now we can only wait quietly. I fell sick during the winter and was bedridden. I was very depressed. The back of my hand was full of holes from the foredrip. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 451. Quietly wait, just wait. The old Duke turned around and stared into the distance once more. His voice was low and deep. It was unknown whether he was talking to the girl or to himself. After a while, he did not turn around. Instead, he turned his back to the youngsters behind him and said in a low voice, "Could it be that you really plan on waiting here and not doing anything? I have already done everything my teacher told me to do. I have done enough. In fact, I have even done more." The girl's voice carried a smile. At this moment, such a smile, such a calm smile, seemed to have a hint of cruelty and coldness. She slowly said, "Teacher once told me something." "What is it?" "Teacher once said, in this world, everyone has their own role. Everyone has their own duty. Do your duty well and do what you should do. Don't do less, but don't do more either. That's all." The girl shrugged her shoulders and the corners of her mouth curled up slightly. "I am just a weak girl. My shoulders cannot carry anything and my hands cannot lift anything. Right now, the city is in chaos. What else can I do? I can only carefully hide in your mansion and drag out an ignoble existence while waiting for everything to pass." The Duke smiled and said in a low voice, "Don't do less, don't do more, just do your part." "Humph, that guy always likes to say these deliberately mystifying nonsense. It's annoying. But the most annoying thing is that these words are all reasonable." He raised his hand and said, "All right. You all stay in my house. I promise, even if this city is overturned, the rebel army will not come to my house to harass me. This old man has accumulated some prestige in his life. Those little fellows, no matter how bold they may be, will not dare to act rashly in front of me." The girl nodded her head and gently touched her face. Then, she sighed and said, "The wind is so cold that my face is numb. Your Excellency the Duke, I will be going down to rest." She turned and left. Vaya stood to the side and looked deeply at the Duke. He seemed to have something to say but hesitated. The old Duke glanced at Vaya and finally said, "If something does happen, I will do my best to protect Adrik's life. However, you should know that fellow's temperament better than me. I fear that if the country really falls, he will not live." Vi gritted his teeth and said, "Who cares about his life?" Although she said that, there was still a trace of gratitude in her purple eyes. Then, she turned around and followed the girl into the room. "Father," Rhodey finally spoke up. There was an eager expression on his face as he looked at the old Duke and clenched his fist. "Are we really not going to do anything? Our family has been blessed by the country." "Enough." The Duke shook his head. His voice sounded tired. He turned and looked at his son with a dignified expression. However, there was a trace of affection in his eyes. He whispered, "This old man understands these principles better than you. To be loyal to the country, to be loyal to the death. These things cannot be said with words. When the time comes, this old man knows what to do. However, for now, you must stay at home obediently. I do not want to give the order to tie you up and lock you up in the cellar." But the old Duke finally turned and took 2 steps forward. He looked at Rhodey and slowly said, "You do not understand what I want to do. I also do not expect you to understand now. I can only tell you that at this time, compared to fighting the rebels, this old man has more important things to do. It's far more valuable for me to continue living than to go into battle and kill a few rebels." The port area had been completely occupied by the rebels. The Lantis fleet and the Byzantine Empire's imperial fleet that was originally stationed at the port had left the port on the day the city was breached. There were still some naval soldiers at the port area. However, some of them were unable to leave with the fleet in time and resisted until the last moment. When the rebels captured the port area, they encountered a certain amount of resistance. This was especially true for the arrow towers at the port. Those towers were originally used to deal with the enemy at sea. The remaining defenders shrank into the arrow towers at the port. The rebels had no choice but to divide their forces and knock down the arrow towers one by one. There was also a large amount of supplies piled up in the warehouse at the port. Many of them were transported by the Lantis through the sea. After obtaining such a large amount of supplies, the rebels even started a small-scale internal strife. Several rebels almost fought over the ownership of the supplies. In the end, Hughes personally came forward to quell the internal strife. After conquering most of Osgiria's cities, the rebel army's generals, officers, and soldiers had all made a small fortune. They had plundered quite a bit of loot. The pockets of these rebels were stuffed with the looted money, and they no longer wanted to continue fighting. The army had lost the will to fight. Almost everyone only thought about how to make a fortune and how to enjoy the wealth they plundered. There was still not much progress in the attack on the palace. At present, they had not even broken through the gates of the palace castle. Hughes and Salvatore had gone to the St. Sophia Cathedral to seek an audience with the leader of the church. Unfortunately, the church still showed enough cunning and opportunistic nature. The rebels could not get any promises from the church. Hughes understood that unless his people personally cut off the emperor's head and the Byzantine Empire was completely dead, the church would not make a stand. Before that, those damn swindlers could completely stay out of it. However, he could not force the church in the slightest. Even in the process of war, the emperor did not dare to force the church. This was because everyone knew that the church had one of the most terrifying forces on the continent, mages. No one dared to provoke the church. If they angered the church, once the church announced that mages were participating in the war, no one could bear the consequences. Hughes only made a probing request. He hoped to use the name of the Pope to announce that the Byzantine Empire's emperor was dethroned and that the emperor's status was illegal. However, after this request was rejected, he had no choice but to give up. He even ordered a portion of his men to maintain order around the church and prevent the red-eyed rebels from harassing the church. At this time, no one was willing to offend the church. On the other hand, Hughes could not effectively command the rebels to attack the palace. He had no choice but to settle for the next best thing. He could only do his best to request the rebels to allocate as much of their forces as possible to strengthen the defenses of the port area. After occupying the port area, they paid a certain price to eliminate the remaining defenders. The rebels immediately occupied the arrow towers along the coast and stationed soldiers according to Hughes's request. Large amounts of bows and crossbows were transported from the warehouse at the docks to supplement the fortifications along the coast. For this, Hughes had no choice but to make some concessions. He gave up on the large amount of resources in the warehouse at the docks to satisfy the greed of the other rebels. In exchange, the defense of the port area finally allowed Hughes to relax slightly. After realizing that he might have made a huge mistake and missed a golden opportunity, Hughes immediately realized his situation. If he could not quickly settle the palace and settle the overall situation, then the Lantis would definitely counterattack from the sea. The Lantis people wanted to take advantage of the war, so they would definitely send reinforcements. This was almost certain. No matter what, he had to complete the attack on the palace before the Lantis landed. As long as his blade chopped off the Emperor's head, then the situation would be settled. The Lantis would have no choice but to give up on participating in the war. He could then sit down and slowly negotiate with the Lantis about the conditions for their retreat. On the 4th day after the siege, Hughes finally received news from the sea. On the 4th day after the siege, the Triumphal Arch was still engaged in a bloody battle. This was already 1 day past the 3 days Adric had promised to boost the morale of the rebels. However, the soldiers of the Triumphal Arch were still engaged in a bloody battle. They were tightly guarding the camp. The walls on both sides of the gate were still resisting the rebels who were pouncing on them from both sides. Salvator's army was still in charge of attacking the Arc de Triomphe. Salvator was well aware of his situation. He didn't conserve his strength like the other rebels. After 4 days of bloody battle, both sides were exhausted. Salvator even sent out his personal guards to charge at the Triumphal Arch again and again. On the other hand, Adric dragged his injured body and personally went into battle to boost the morale of the rebels. He fought again, and at the same time, he shouted countless times to boost the morale of his men. Although 3 days had passed, the morale of his men did not collapse, especially when they made use of a counterattack to force the rebels out of a street. As the leader of the rebels, Salvator, had personally gone to the front lines, his position was too far forward. In the chaos, he was almost killed by the counterattack of the Empire's army. Such an achievement greatly boosted the morale of the defenders. The Arc de Triomphe was still firmly in the hands of the defenders. Salvator had really done his best. He could not imagine how such a small group of defenders could still have such tenacious determination to resist after the entire city had fallen. The streets were littered with corpses. After days of bloody battle, both sides had no chance to take a breather. The corpses could only be left on the battlefield on the street. The rebels and the defenders were all mixed together. There were also some places where the traces of fire could still be seen clearly. The rebels had tried to use fire to attack, but a heavy snowfall at night caused the plan to fail. The arrival of the heavy snowfall gave Adric's men a chance to take a breather. At the very least, the rebels' plan to use fire to attack had failed. Furthermore, the heavy snowfall allowed the defenders, who had been without water for 2 days, to finally have some drinking water. The soldiers quickly gathered up the snow and melted it in a large pot. Then, they carefully distributed the limited amount of water to every soldier. "Hold on. We have already held on until now. From now on, every 2 hours, Lantis men could come from the sea. We are almost at dawn. For the Empire. Fight!" Adric raised his sword and shouted. He had lost count of how many times he had said these words over the past few days. But now, no matter how hard he tried, his voice could not be as full as it was a few days ago. His breathing was weak. During the fierce battle yesterday, he had taken a blow to his chest. Although most of the force had been blocked by the armor, The opponent who had cut him was a rebel general. The strength of the fighting aura had still caused damage to his body. Adrik suspected that his ribs might have been broken, but he could only force himself to hold on. He was now the only hope for the entire army. He could not show any signs of weakness. Perhaps in the next moment, Lantis' men would arrive. Almost everyone had this thought in their minds. Although some people had begun to doubt and waver, at this moment, they had no other choice but to believe in this thought. On the fourth day, the defenders of the Arc de Triomphe, under General Adrik's encouragement, repelled the rebel army 11 times. The fierce battle lasted until sunset, when the rebel army finally retreated for a moment. In the camp, there was no one left who could stand. The moment the rebel army retreated, almost everyone sat on the ground. Regardless of whether it was the general or the soldiers, they were all panting. Only the doctors who came up later anxiously ran back and forth amidst the cries of the wounded soldiers, making use of the rare time they had to treat the wounded soldiers. After 4 days of fierce battle, there were less than 3,000 of the original 8,000 defenders left. Adrik knew that with the strength he had left, it was impossible for him to hold on until sunset tomorrow. Perhaps today was the last time they would be able to see the sunset in their lives. The less than 3,000 defenders were all wounded and exhausted. Most of them had not slept for 3 days. Fatigue, wounded soldiers, hunger and thirst, and the fear of death were all tormenting their will. Some of the soldiers were so exhausted that they vomited blood. The archers had long since lost the ability to draw their bows. The fingers of some archers had been cut to pieces by the bowstrings. Some could not even lift their arms. The last sunset, perhaps. When the sun set, everyone, including Adrik, could not help but turn their gazes to the west. They watched as the sun set and the afterglow of the setting sun slowly disappeared into the horizon. "Sir." A military officer limped over to Adrik's side. The original color of the armor on his body could no longer be recognized. His shoulder had been cut open and his flesh was badly mangled. He only had 3 fingers left on his hand, which were wrapped up in gauze. The military officer stood beside Adrik and bowed deeply. "It is my greatest honor to be able to fight alongside you." After the first one, the officers walked to Adaric's side one after another. Everyone saluted to Auderic before silently looking at their commander. Adrik took a deep breath. At this time, he found that he could no longer say anything to boost the morale of the soldiers. At this moment, everyone knew that they had reached the end of their rope. At this time, it would be laughable to say anything to boost the morale of the soldiers. "Thank you." The military officer solemnly returned the salute. Then Adrik took a deep breath. "I have nothing else to say. I am proud of all of you. You are all true soldiers of the Empire, heroes. I cannot make any other promises to you. I can only say, I will fight with you. When the final moment comes, I will die with you." No one said anything. Everyone quietly looked at Adrik. Not a trace of hesitation could be seen in their eyes. Adrik's eyes were filled with tears. Then, he took a deep breath. "Blow the horn. Blow the triumphant return. Let the imperial palace hear us. Let them know that we are still fighting. We will continue to fight." The soldier blowing the horn was already exhausted. However, at this moment, under Adrik's command, several military officers stepped forward and took the horn. They stood in a row and blew the horn. The mighty and majestic triumphant return of the Empire rang out. At this time of sunset, the last rays of the setting sun reverberated across this ancient city. At this moment, the majestic tune seemed to carry with it an indescribable sense of tragedy. The bugle horn sounded again and again until the afterglow of the sun finally disappeared completely. "Get ready." Adrik gritted his teeth and said in a deep voice, "They will definitely take advantage of the night to launch a surprise attack. Everyone, this may be our final battle. Everything for the Empire. For the Empire." All the military officers straightened their bodies. Just as the last note of the triumphant return came to an end, the sound of the horn came to an abrupt stop and the echoes gradually disappeared. Suddenly, a slight movement could be heard from afar, accompanied by the sound of the wind. This caused Adric's eyelids to twitch. He abruptly jumped onto a pile of boxes and anxiously looked towards the south. Following the sound of the wind, the distant sound could be heard intermittently. It was not clear, but when it entered Adric's ears, it was like thunder. "Horn, horn, it's the sound of a horn," Adric muttered to himself, his voice trembling. Suddenly, his eyes shone and he shouted loudly. "It's the military horn of the Lantis! It's the Lantis military horn!" The sound of the horn was faint, but soon, a rumbling sound could be heard coming from the south. It was like muffled thunder, accompanied by the sound of the wind. In the distance, in the south, in the direction of the port, rays of light shot up into the sky. After reaching the middle of the sky, they quickly exploded and scattered down a stretch of light. "It's the signal from the sea! It's the signal from the sea! It's the signal from the Lantis warship!" Adric's body suddenly staggered. He felt as though all the strength within his body had been sucked away. He stared with widened eyes at the southern sky. Night had fallen, but the signal from the fireworks was so clear in the sky. "It's here. Finally, it's here." Under the curtain of night, the land remained silvery white. The dense sound of horse hooves sounded tired and somewhat chaotic. The cavalrymen passed through with the wind. When they charged through the city gates, Shea finally breathed a sigh of relief. It was as though the strength that he had been holding back all this time had finally dissipated. When they charged into the city, Shea was received by the cavalrymen and was nearly thrown off his horse. By the time several cavalrymen from Denzel City came forward to carry him up, Shea's entire body was already cold. The cold wind and snow that they had been through all this time had caused Shea to be unable to hold on any longer. His body was already numb, and he was practically carried into the garrison headquarters by the soldiers. Although it was night time, the news of Shea's return and his arrival into the city caused all the military officers and generals in Denzel City to urgently gather in the garrison headquarters. Shea did not rest. He did not even have the time to change his clothes or drink a mouthful of water before he was immediately carried into the garrison headquarters meeting hall. Old Mad Dog Green and practically all the high-ranking military officers under Shea's command were gathered here. Seeing Shea's return, everyone was somewhat surprised. Old Green's face was ashen. "I have nothing else to explain." Shea's lips had turned blue and he refused a guard who was about to come forward to drape a blanket over him. He walked to the front and stood before the commander-in-chief's table. He looked at everyone and said, "Now, everyone, listen to my orders." An uproar broke out below. None of them had expected this commander-in-chief, who had been away for so long, to suddenly return and immediately give out an order. Additionally, judging by his tone and expression, there was an unprecedented level of solemnity and seriousness. "Everyone, prepare for emergency battle." Although Shea's voice was hoarse and tired, his tone was resolute. "The 1st Division, prepare for battle immediately. I will give you 2 days' time. Distribute the military equipment to every soldier. If there is insufficient, go get it from Ka-Tua from the military supply department. I know that our food reserves are insufficient. From this moment onwards, we will enter a period of war. Prioritize all food supplies for the army. I don't care what method you use. Within these 2 days, get all the food you can get. You must have enough food supplies to last for at least 30 days of war. The 2nd Division, leave 1 emblem regiment in Denzel City and 1 emblem regiment in Metter City. The rest are to prepare for battle as the 2nd echelon. This order is not to be disobeyed." There was an uproar. Green was immediately furious. He seemed to want to glare and ask something, but Shea glared at him fiercely. Green saw the unprecedented seriousness and resoluteness in Shea's eyes. He subconsciously shut his mouth and took a deep breath. He suppressed his anger and said in a low voice, "What about the direction of our attack?" "South. Manninger, Odin, Scarlet Snow Army." Shea looked coldly at everyone below. "I know you have doubts in your hearts. Keep these doubts and prepare for battle first. Do what you have to do. As for the explanation, you will get it. But not now. Remember your own duty. Do what you have to do. Don't do less and don't do more." To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 452. With a belly full of questions, the generals under his command left one by one. Even Reinhardt was no exception. Green was the last to leave. He looked at Shea and said, "You had better have a good enough reason. Launching an attack on Manninger in winter is a risky move. It may even be suicidal." "Of course I have a reason." Shea nodded, his expression slightly relaxed. Looking at Green, Shea's eyes also showed some gratitude. "Thank you for not opposing me in public just now." Green was expressionless. "You are the commander-in-chief of the army. I have the responsibility and obligation to uphold your authority in front of the generals. Now, tell me, Shea, what is wrong with you?" Shea exhaled and looked at Green. There was a slight struggle in his eyes. But soon, he seemed to have finally made up his mind. Slowly and firmly, he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Green. I'm very grateful for your cooperation just now. But I can't tell you now. 2 days later, before the battle, I'll tell you. Now execute the order, General Green." At the end of his words, Shea's tone even carried a bit of solemnity and sternness. Green gritted his teeth and walked out. Shea finally sat down on the ground. His whole body was sore, but he still took a breath. "Men, go, ask General Nene to come over. Tell her I have something to discuss with her." Within Shea's small group of generals, from the first day of the formation of this group, Nene was a very special existence. First of all, she was Shea's earliest team. She brought with her 2,000 horse bandits to join Shea. The quality was high, no less than the regular elite cavalry of the Empire. In the early days of the formation of Shea's small group, those 2,000 horse bandits and cavalry were the force that Shea relied on the most. They were also the most effective force that Shea used to subdue the remnants of the 6th and 7th Corps. It could be said that from this perspective, Nene was a core member of Shea's emerging military group. The second special thing was that basically all the high-ranking officers and generals in the army more or less knew a little about this valiant and fierce woman. There seemed to be something wrong with her relationship with Commander-in-Chief Sir Shea. This point was fully illustrated by the fact that those arrogant horse gang unscrupulously addressed Shea as son-in-law. He was a core member of the Shea military group, the leader of the troops that Shea had built up, and at the same time, he had an ambiguous and strange relationship with the Commander-in-Chief. All of these were enough to form Nene's current special status. Although her position in Shea's army was not high, ranking behind Green, Sharba, Katoa and other members of Shea's old team, and even below Reinhardt and some of the senior officers of the 6th and 7th Corps who had joined later. However, no one really dared to show the slightest contempt for Miss Nene. This was because there were people who had seen with their own eyes how this valiant Miss Panny had defeated Sarba, who was widely acknowledged as the most ferocious general in the army, 7 to 8 times with her bare hands. This caused Sarba to run away whenever he saw Panny. Not only did his subordinates show him enough respect, but even Shea, as the commander-in-chief, also gave him special treatment. Basically, he never made any restrictions on him. Even the incorruptible Green also looked at him in a new light. After all, it was the 2,000 horse bandits and cavalrymen that Nei had brought to Shea's present situation. The only unsettling factor was that ever since Lord Shea announced his marriage, the lady of the inner court had never set foot in Denzel City again. She spent most of her time in the barracks outside the city. The 1st Division's main camp was just outside the city. The cavalry's camp was built separately. The remnants of the original Roadrear cavalry, as well as the mounted bandit cavalry, were all incorporated into the 1st Division to form an independent cavalry division. The commander of this cavalry division was Sharba, one of Shea's corps members. He was an old comrade of the Roadrear cavalry and was once General Adric's personal guard. The pure and honest Roadrear cavalry was enough to convince the remnants of the Roadrear cavalry. Besides, Sharba himself was an outstanding warrior with a majestic stature, brute strength and martial prowess. He was also one of Shea's oldest comrades in arms. Everyone believed in his loyalty to Shea. It could be said that no one objected to him being the commander of this cavalry division. Nene, on the other hand, held a special position within this independent cavalry division. She was an inconspicuous flag-bearer. Nene almost never entered the city. She was even absent from most of the previous military meetings. Today, when Shea sent someone to summon Nene from outside the city, even the soldier who sent the order felt strange. Nene did not cause any trouble for Shea. After receiving Shea's order, she galloped into the city and arrived at the garrison mansion in less than half an hour. This was a very formal and official-looking meeting between a subordinate and a superior. Nene followed the rules. When she arrived at the garrison mansion, she first had someone report her identity. Then, she used her official position and customs to report her identity. Using an almost flawless method, she met with Shea, or rather, flag-bearer Nene requests an audience with Lord Marshal Shea Thunder. Steady and powerful footsteps and the sound of leather boots rubbing against each other could be heard. When Nene strode in, she held a helmet that looked like a cavalry general with one hand before her chest. She walked in with her head held high and her chest puffed out. She looked straight ahead and stared indifferently into Shea's eyes. When she arrived before Shea, she put her legs together and straightened her body. She performed a loud military salute before looking at Shea with an indifferent gaze. Flag-bearer Nene of the 1st Independent Cavalry Division greets Lord Marshal. Shea looked at Nene, who was standing before him. It had been quite some time since he last saw this woman. Her cheeks appeared thinner and weathered. Clearly, this woman had been tormenting herself for the past few days. Most likely, she had led the cavalry out for training. Despite the fact that it was winter, her suntanned skin from the summer had yet to fully recover. Her entire person appeared dark and thin. However, her eyes were very bright, a sharp kind of brightness. Shea felt a sense of guilt as he looked at Nene. After a while, Shea opened his mouth and said, "Nene, right now I need your help." Nene did not say anything. She continued to look at Shea. "I know we don't have enough time. We have yet to reach the time that I promised you. I also know that you still have many questions. However, I have to regretfully inform you that we do not have any more time. We do not have even one extra day left. I need to mobilize the forces in your hands, although I am not sure if this is the best time to mobilize them. However, I have no other choice. I must win this war. If we cannot win, then our men, my subordinates, my colleagues, many of them will die. Many of them will face a tragic end. Nene, I know there are still some issues between us that have yet to be completely resolved. However, right now, I need to temporarily let go of these issues. I need the forces in your hands." Shea's voice was very sincere. Nene's eyebrows twitched slightly. She finally opened her mouth and said in a calm tone, "What do I need to do? I only have 2 days. Your men must make all the necessary preparations. You will be facing a battle, This will also be the most difficult, and also the most important battle in this war. The hope of winning or losing all depends on you. If you fail, the entire army will be routed, and the entire situation will collapse. I will entrust the lives of many people to you. Shea's voice became softer. He gazed at Nene and said, Nene, can I trust you? Nene lowered her head as if she was thinking for a while. Then, she raised her head to look at Shea and asked, I need some extra special military funds. My men have been working too hard. They need some money to settle down. Yes. You can get it from Ka-Tua. I will give you a warrant. There are still some armors that do not meet our requirements. I still need at least 100 sets of those special ones. Ka-Tua will send those armors to your camp by tomorrow morning at the latest. Shea still promised without hesitation. Before we depart, I want to replenish a batch of the best fodder. Also, I need a warrant from you. My men will not accept Sharba's orders. I have the authority to make my own decisions on the battlefield. Shea quickly said, Naturally, I understand. I am the one who personally gave you that force. Nene, I trust you. There is no doubt about that. The two of them exchanged glances. This time, their eyes appeared somewhat unfocused. Following Shea's return and the emergency order to prepare for war, Denzel City fell into chaos. It was already the end of the year, the season of winter. Due to the fact that it was a time of war, everyone's days were somewhat tense. However, Denzel City had not seen the flames of war for several months. Thus, the people within the city had more or less gotten used to the tranquility. However, after the order to prepare for war was issued, the entire city fell into chaos. The officials were busy checking the storehouses and filling up the last batch of tax rations into the military storehouses. Those rations were originally reserved for next spring. But now, all the rations were given priority to replenish the military. The chief logistics officer, Ka-Tua, immediately became the busiest person in the city. He was responsible for receiving and checking the rations that were sent over. He was also responsible for distributing the rations to every army. Shea had issued a clear order for the rations to be carried over for 30 days. The logistics department was also responsible for recruiting civilian laborers and mobilizing auxiliary soldiers to form logistics and military supply teams to replenish the various armies. In addition, there was also the replenishment of a large amount of military equipment. Those that were insufficient, those that were damaged, those that were lacking in training. Ka-Tua did not sleep for 2 days and 2 nights. Like all the officers in the logistics department under his command, everyone's eyes were as red as those of Rabbit. After 2 days and 2 nights in the logistics department, Ka-Tua's throat was already hoarse from all the shouting. The words that came out of his mouth were like that of a duck that had caught a cold. He was almost lashing the officers and soldiers in the logistics department with his whip. They had to send all the rations to every army in 2 days. This task was simply inhumane. In the end, Ka-Tua even risked everything. After he got Shea's permission, he forcibly transferred a part of the rations for civilian use. Only then could he barely fill up the rations for the army. Everyone knew that war was different from peace. Once war broke out, the consumption of rations would be at least 30% higher than peacetime. Soldiers would sweat and bleed in the war, so they would consume more rations than usual. However, these were not the things that drove Ka-Tua crazy. The thing that drove him crazy was the distribution of the materials for the war horses. Shea's family was still too weak. Previously, Ka-Tua had to tear down the eastern wall to pay the western wall to barely maintain the current situation. During peacetime, everyone could barely survive this winter if they had to eat their fill. However, once war broke out, all the problems were exposed. The rations for civilian use were almost emptied by Ka-Tua. Even though the officials in the county government complained to Ka-Tua that if this continued, there would be a situation where people would starve to death next spring. If the rations for civilian use could not be replenished by next spring, then the civilians and farmers would use their anger to tear these officials apart. Shaya's territory, until now, was still carrying out the rations for war. There were even officials who ran to Shaya to complain to Shaya. Shaya only had one answer: people will starve to death next year? I can only tell you that if we don't win this war in winter, then we won't starve to death next winter. Yes, we won't starve to death. We will all die under the butcher's knife. If we win this war, we will naturally be able to take back the rations from Odin's storehouse. Otherwise, only death awaits us. The chaotic 2 days finally passed in the blink of an eye. Even though Shaya's first division had done their best, they were still unable to fully prepare for war in just 2 days. In the end, Grim compromised and concentrated all the rations into the 2 main emblem regiment. After that, the 2 regiments that were fully equipped with rations would be the first to set out for war. Just last night, the pre-war military meeting was finally held. Grim finally received an answer from Shaya. The contents of this military meeting were very simple. It could even be said that it was extremely rushed. There was no comprehensive battle plan. There was not even a hierarchy or wave of deployment for the army. There was no roundabout way. There was not even the slightest bit of variety. The entire so-called battle plan could even be said to be a simple marching order. On this excessively simple battle plan, there was only a thick line drawn with a carbon pen between the capital cities of Moore County and Ilton County on the map. After drawing a straight line, there was a line of words written below it. Follow this straight line to the south of Denzel City. The army will advance in a straight line. All we need to do is to push forward and push forward. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 453. GOR Chapter 429 Condoms. The cold weapons warfare of this era was not as simple as one might imagine. This was especially true for a battle between armies of over 10,000 men. It was not as one might imagine, where both sides would line up in the wilderness, face off against each other, and then charge forward to kill each other with a single sound of a horn. After all, this was not a brawl between 100 men. In a cold weapons war between large armies, it was often a battle of command. For example, when an army set out, launched an attack, and marched into battle, it was necessary to formulate a detailed battle plan and marching strategy. The route of the march, the supply, the vanguard, the center, and the rear guard should be taken care of. Scattered soldiers should be set up on both sides. In addition, a large number of mounted scouts had to be sent out. It was unknown how many small teams were sent out according to the directions given by their superiors. Countless mounted scouts were sent back and forth to investigate and search, sending piece after piece of information back to the Central Army for the Commander-in-Chief to refer to. Not only was it to scout the terrain, it was also to scout the enemy's movement. Generally speaking, a cold weapons war between large armies would begin with the mounted scouts of both sides. The mounted scouts would be sent out by both sides to scout each other. After repeated clashes, the mounted scouts would often be the first to bleed and die. Countless skirmishes between mounted scouts and small skirmishes would set the tone for a large army war. From these countless skirmishes, the army would be able to obtain the most accurate information about the enemy, such as the enemy's whereabouts, the surrounding terrain, the enemy's morale, how strong their resistance was, whether they had the courage to fight in the open, and so on. It could be said that in order to complete a cold weapon war involving more than 10,000 men, at least 70 to 80% of the process was composed of the seemingly small marching strategy and the small skirmishes between the roaming cavalry. By the time the two armies finally clashed and the battle was decided, half of the battle would have already been decided. Therefore, the ability to formulate a detailed battle strategy and marching strategy was the most important criterion to judge whether a commander was qualified or not. As for whether he led the charge in the final battle or not, it was actually not that important. A general who could lead the charge with his soldiers might be an outstanding general, but he might not be an excellent commander. Because of this reason, when Sheya's battle plan was conveyed to the First Corps that was preparing to set out, all the officers and commanders were dumbfounded. This commander, he couldn't be joking, right? A straight line was drawn between Denzel City and the capital of Ilton County. After that, the entire army was pushed forward along the straight line. Other than that, there was nothing else. What marching strategy, who the vanguard should be, who the rear guard should be, how the supplies should be moved, and how many cavalrymen should be assigned to patrol the surroundings. Not a single word was mentioned. The generals in the army, most of them were veterans of the 6th and 7th Corps. They were all from the Imperial Central Army and had spent half their lives in the army. Yet none of them had ever seen such a sloppy, crude, and irresponsible battle plan. It seemed that this commander-in-chief Shah was really treating this war of 10,000 people as a trick of 100 people fighting with weapons. Green could no longer hold back. He resisted the urge to slap Shea's face with the battle plan. Instead, he looked at him with a dark face and asked, "Sir, may I ask, what is the objective of this battle? Are we going to force the Odin to defend the city with a forceful attack? Or are we going to lure the enemy out for a field battle? If we are going to fight at night, what are the most suitable locations for our army to engage in a field battle?" Shea looked at Green shamelessly and said, "None of them." "What?" Green thought that he had misheard and said, "None of them? Sir, what do you mean by that? None of them? You mean, we are not going to attack the city, and we are not going to force the Odin to engage in a field battle with us? Then, what are you planning?" Shea touched his nose and said, "I said, we are going to follow this route and push our army in a straight line." He pointed at the border area between the two counties on the map and said, "Manning and the Scarlet Snow Army are proud and arrogant. Facing our sudden attack, I don't think they will sit back and defend the city. They will definitely not sit back and watch us advance smoothly. Instead, they will organize an army and fight us head-on. Once our army moves out and enters Ilton County, the Scarlet Snow Army's army will come and stop us before we are more than 100 miles away." "You mean, we are going to engage in a field battle?" Green gritted his teeth. "I said, none of them." Shea smacked his lips and said, "If the Odin people come, you guys will confront them. When the time comes, both sides will face each other. There is no need to fight them. Just watch them. If you can fight, fight. If you can't, don't fight. Always maintain an attacking posture and stay there." Green finally understood. He stared at Shea and said, "You mean our main army's mission is just to attract their attention? Not to fight?" Shea finally smiled and said, "Most of our soldiers are afraid of the cold. The Odin people come from the bitter cold of the northern kingdom. They are more adapted to winter than us. At this time, Lao Tzu is not that stupid to send a large army out to engage in a field battle with the Odin people." Green followed Shea's words and said tentatively, "So, according to your plan, we will not send a vanguard cavalry, nor will we set up roaming cavalry and scattered cavalry. We will not compete with the enemy in terms of scouting, and we will not hide our track. We will just march our army over with great fanfare, of course. What I want is for you to attract as much of Manninger's main army as possible. The sooner the enemy knows about your movements, the better. No vanguard, no scouts, just follow the main road. Once you meet the Odin main army, just stand in front. There is no need to fight them. But you are also not allowed to retreat. Just stand in front and don't retreat a single step. Just make them feel uncomfortable." Green's expression was somewhat uncertain. "Sir, by doing this, you are putting the entire army in danger. We only have this much strength. Once the main army is thrown to the front, we will do as you said and stand in front. We will not fight or retreat. Odin's forces have the time to calmly outflank us and make arrangements before swallowing us whole. I've never heard of such a strategy where one cupped one's hands and gave the initiative to the opponent from the start. If you do this, how can we defeat the enemy? The cowardly will starve to death and the bold will be stuffed to death. Shea's expression was stern. I naturally have a way to defeat the enemy, but it is not on you. My request is that you march along the main road with great fanfare and attract as much of the Odin troops as possible. I will naturally have a way to defeat the enemy. He looked at Green. Trust me unconditionally. Whether Shea's brain was damaged or he really had some genius idea, Green had no choice but to listen to him this time. Launching an attack on the Odin in winter was originally a crazy plan. The departure of the 1st Division was according to Shea's request. The main army moved slowly, without any diversion, without any cavalry to open the way. The army marched south along the main road. The troops accompanying the departure of the division were the 2 main emblem regiments of the 1st Division under Shea's command and the Independent Cavalry Regiment led by Sharba of more than 3,000 cavalry. Although this battle plan made many senior officers uncertain, they were slightly relieved to see the independent cavalry regiments following the army. These were the elite cavalry of Rhodria in the past. The urgent deployment of resources could only be done by the 2 emblem regiments of infantry and Sharba's cavalry. The following troops followed. Early the next morning, another 3 emblem regiments set off. They sped up and chased after the army at the front. At this point, the 1st Division under Shea's command consisted of 5 emblem regiments of about 13,000 men. There were also 20,000 men from the auxiliary troops and the supply and transportation camp. In addition to the Independent Cavalry Regiment, the total number of men was close to 25,000. Such a large-scale army marching was almost Shea's entire fortune. Since the formation of his small group, this was the first time such a large-scale military operation and the first time so many soldiers and horses were mobilized. Although they had some complaints about the winter attack, seeing such a large-scale army marching on the road, and the long lines spread out on the road, the army was majestic, and the cavalry of the Independent Cavalry Regiment was even more powerful. The army had always been a group of courageous people. The more people there were, the stronger the momentum. Although everyone was still uneasy, they were encouraged by the majestic army in front of them. Shea had handed over the role of commander of the 1st Division to Grim. His body had not recovered and he did not have the ability to lead troops into battle. Everyone silently agreed on this point. Moreover, compared to this irresponsible commander, it seemed more reassuring to have the experienced and prudent Grim lead the army. 25,000 infantry and cavalry followed the main road all the way to the south. The rations and equipment that they brought with them were only enough to last them for 10 days or so. Within the borders of Moor Prefecture, there was still their own territory along the way. But once they left Moor Prefecture, there would be no more replenishment. Along the way, Grim's brows were never relaxed. He knew very well that the troops he brought along were almost all of the elite troops in the army. Although there was a 2nd Division in Moor Prefecture, the 2nd Division was only used as a backup force. Whether it was training, equipment, or the quality of the soldiers, they were 1 or 2 levels lower than the 1st Division. It was like gambling in a casino, and all the chips were pushed out in the first round. How could Grim relax? The 25,000 troops marched on with great fanfare. Along the way, they did not send small groups of cavalry to cover the army's tracks. But Grim gave the order to march with great urgency. In less than 6 days, the army had left the borders of Moor Prefecture and entered the borders of Ilton Prefecture in the south. The commotion along the way was huge. The Odin people in Ilton County must have caught wind of the news a long time ago. As expected, Just as the army crossed the border and entered Ilton Prefecture, the Odin people's reindeer cavalry appeared on both sides of the main road to spy on them in the afternoon. In this kind of situation, according to the standard battle strategy, they should send out their own cavalry and beat back the enemy scouts who were spying on the army's tracks. But Grim ordered the cavalry to stay put and only advance on the main road. He ignored the scouts from the Odin people who appeared on both sides of the road. The cavalry that accompanied the army were all Rodrir cavalry. Which one of them was not proud and arrogant? Such an order was really suffocating. Along the way, the number of scouts from the Odin people seemed to be increasing. In the beginning, there were only 3 to 5 reindeer cavalry. Later on, there were dozens of them spying on them from afar. In the end, there were even traces of the Odin people's elite Icefield hunters. The army advanced on the main road towards the south in a grandiose manner. This kind of restraint made the Odin people somewhat indecisive. Finally, at night, 100 Odin reindeer cavalry on the left side spied on the Byzantium army again and again. Seeing that there was no movement from the Byzantium army, the reindeer cavalry boldly increased the distance between them. The cavalry even whistled and ran to within an arrow's distance of the advancing army. At this time, Grim finally ordered the army to counterattack. The cavalry division split into a small group and ruthlessly beat back the 100 Odin cavalry. However, Grim strictly ordered them not to pursue too freely. The cavalry could only hold their breaths. After beating back the Odin cavalry, they hurriedly turned around and returned to the main group. The Odin people lost dozens of their cavalry and did not dare to push too hard. On the second day of the march, Grim's face became gloomier. The army was now in the enemy's territory, and Sheya's order was to go all the way south. Along the way, they were not to attack any of the cities and towns. Instead, they were to go around them and push south. After the last replenishment before entering the border, the army only had enough supplies to last for half a month. If they tried their best, they would only be able to last for 20 days. Now that they were in enemy territory, there were more and more small groups of Odin people spying on them. Along the way, the shadows of the Odin people could be seen everywhere in the distant mountain forests. Odin people seemed to be at a loss as to what to do with their army that had just entered the border. It was probably because Manninger did not expect that they would actually have such a large army in the middle of winter. Grim was very clear that no matter how shocked or surprised Manninger was, the other party would definitely quickly respond. 2 days was enough for Manninger to do a lot of things. The other party was definitely nervously mobilizing a large group of troops and then setting up an inescapable net. Every step his army took forward was the same as looking at the trap that they had dug a little deeper into. When Manninger finished setting up, he would organize a large army to block Grim's way. At the same time, he would be surrounded by Odin people from all directions. Regarding the most recent update, I need to explain. I'm very sick. This year's winter seems to be especially hard to bear. My body is still relatively weak right now. I've been entangled with my illness for half a month. As the saying goes, it comes like a mountain collapsing, but it leaves like silk. I can't help it. I really can't help it. It's not what I want. I'll get better in a few days. Once my body recovers, I'll naturally be able to update normally. While I'm sick, I'd like to apologize to all my readers. The winter weather is cold and the temperature drops abnormally. Everyone, take care of yourselves. Health comes first, to be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 454. GOR Chapter 430 Surprise Attack. Odin's army had assembled in the northern part of Ilton County. The northern part of Ilton County seemed to have become a huge net, and the net seemed to be gradually tightening. Odin's Scarlet Snow Army, led by Manninger, was surprised that the northern Byzantine Empire had the guts to launch an attack on their side during winter. However, they did not hesitate to assemble their army. They were determined to devour the enemy that had penetrated deep into their territory. Even Manninger himself admired the courage of the Byzantine Empire's commander. Although this courage was a little reckless, Manninger was not without joy. If they could annihilate the enemy in this battle, then there would be no more resistance in the northern part of the Byzantine Empire. Although his probing advance had ended in failure, it did not prevent Manninger from making the correct judgment of the situation. This Odin's army was one of the few outstanding commanders with brains. He had keenly sensed that the northern resistance behind him was actually not very strong. It was only an army of 10 to 20,000 people. If they could solve the problem in this battle, Manninger would naturally be more than happy to do so. End this battle in winter. With this battle, we can completely solve our worries in one fell swoop. When spring comes, our army can concentrate on invading the south. Our Odin has mobilized so many troops this time. We won't be satisfied with just a few counties. Manninger was in high spirits. Under his urging, the Odin's Scarlet Snow Army, which had just annexed the Corsica military region, gathered all the way here under his strict orders. Although the Odin's army was valiant and good at fighting, they had fought several battles this year. The war to annex the Corsica military region lasted for more than 2 months. The Corsica military region resisted tenaciously at the beginning. Although the Odin's Scarlet Snow Army achieved a great victory in the end, the entire army was quite exhausted. After fighting for half a year, the Scarlet Snow Army urgently needed a period of rest. They originally planned to take advantage of this winter to recuperate and recover their strength. However, under Manninger's eagerness to win, the various Odin's army mustered up their courage and strictly followed the orders of their patriarch. The Odin's army marched south and gathered in the north of Ilton County. Gradually, they surrounded the lone army led by Grimm that had penetrated deep into the enemy's territory. Manninger himself was personally dispatched from the county governor of Ilton County. He personally led the army to take command. For a moment, the northern part of Ilton County was like an inescapable net. Once the pocket was tightened, Grimm's lone army would be swallowed whole. It snowed all night. The snowflakes were the size of goose feathers. After a night of falling, when the sky gradually brightened, the land was already a vast expanse. The silvery white color seemed to have covered the sky and the earth. Between heaven and earth, there was no other color except this white. Shea sat on the back of his horse. He exhaled white air from his mouth and rubbed his hands hard. After rushing for half the night on the horse's back, his whole body was almost frozen. His ears were so cold that he could barely feel them. His nose was red and his eyebrows were covered in a layer of frost. Beside him, there were 2 cavalrymen following closely behind him, guarding this general at all times. This was a small path in the northeastern part of Ilton County. This was not the main road. Previously, only some local villagers and townspeople traveled together. After the spread of the war, the local villages and towns were almost empty. The villages were deserted and there was no sign of human habitation. The nearby roads were also no longer maintained. There was also a river here. It was originally a tributary of the north. There were no bridges across the river. In the past, during peacetime, only the nearby villages and towns organized manpower to build simple docks on both sides of the river. They arranged for peasant soldiers to ferry the people across the river. Occasionally, it was enough for the local villagers to travel with them. This place was geographically remote and there were no large caravans passing through. The transportation capacity of this small ferry port was enough to meet the daily needs of the locals. However, after the war, most of the people in the nearby villages and towns fled. A small number of them were also driven away by Odin's people to become slaves. The villages and towns were emptied. Naturally, there were no boatmen on the ferry. Sheya's entourage had taken advantage of the night to come here. They had hurriedly marched all the way here. Sheya, who was sitting on his horse, heard the whistle of the cavalryman in front of him. His spirits were immediately lifted. He mustered up his strength and urged his horse to gallop forward until he was at the forefront of the cavalryman. Looking around, a smile appeared on his frozen face. "Ha! It seems the heavens have not forsaken me. This heavy snowfall has indeed helped Lao Tzu out a great deal." The river before them had been frozen by the cold winter weather. The river, which was originally flowing rapidly, had been frozen into a thick layer of ice. Looking around, they saw that the upper and lower reaches of the river had been frozen. Sheya quickly smiled and said, "Send someone to check if the ice on the surface of the river is thick enough. Our cavalrymen are heavy. It would be best if they don't fall." At that moment it seemed as though his cavalrymen were the only ones left in this barren land. The cavalrymen behind Sheya formed a long line on this vast white land. All the cavalrymen in the cavalrymen were wearing thick leather jackets. They did not seem to be wearing any armor. Their attire was somewhat strange. However, the cavalrymen behind them were not small. Sheya's cavalrymen were neither too many nor too few. There were exactly 800 cavalrymen. However, this cavalryman seemed to be far more than that. This was because Sheya had spent a lot of money to equip this cavalryman. Every cavalryman was equipped with 2 war horses and a heavy mule. 800 cavalrymen, but there were more than 2,500 mounts. This was an anomaly. This was because Sheya had great expectations for this cavalryman. He did not hesitate to spend a lot of money to build this cavalryman. In this cavalryman, every cavalryman was riding an ordinary war horse. The reins beside them were tied to a horse and a mule. Speaking of mounts, it was also very strange. The cavalrymen did not wear any armor. They only wore thick leather jackets to protect them from the cold. However, all their weapons and armor were tied to the back of the mule beside them. Every mule and horse was a set of cavalrymen's heavy armor. The appearance of this heavy armor was very eye-catching. It was actually a rarely seen full body armor. Chest armor, body armor, shoulder guards, arm guards, leg guards, and the helmet was also the most expensive type of heavy armor. In this era of cold weapons, this kind of full body armor was something that even the heavy cavalrymen of the Empire could not equip. Every set of armor was built with a lot of money. A large amount of iron was used. The weight of this set of armor was probably around 150 jin. Even in the army, only the generals of the heavy cavalrymen could wear such heavy armor. If an ordinary soldier were to wear such heavy armor, it would be difficult for them to move. It was as if they were carrying the weight of another person. It would be difficult for them to walk, let alone ride a horse into battle. In the history of the army, only a few outstanding warriors or courageous generals would wear such heavy armor. However, in this troop of 800 cavalrymen led by Sheya, this kind of abnormal heavy armor seemed to have become a common basic equipment. Other than the heavy full-body armor, the mule and horse were also equipped with the cavalrymen's long weapons. These long weapons were all heavy weapons. There were heavy cavalry spears, hammers, double-edged axes, etc. They were all different from each other. After careful calculation, if a cavalryman in this troop were to wear the full body armor and carry the heavy weapon, the weight of his entire body would be at least 200 jin. With such heavy equipment, it was no wonder that every cavalryman was assigned a mule and horse to accompany them. If not, carrying such heavy equipment for a long journey, the war horses would have been crushed to death by the time they reached their destination. How would they be able to fight in battle? What was even more unusual was the horse behind every cavalryman. The strange thing was, in this troop, the horse behind every cavalryman seemed to be even more majestic and tall than the war horses under the cavalrymen. Each and every horse was at least 2 heads taller than the original war horses. Their bones were thick and majestic. As they galloped, the heavy breaths of the horses exhaled white puffs of air. The muscles on the horses were as tough as steel. Byzantium had always been known for its cavalrymen. Especially the roadrear cavalrymen, they were the soul of the Byzantium's elite army. Naturally, they had their own unique way of training and selecting war horses. Generally speaking, ordinary war horses were only the height of a person. In the military, the light cavalrymen used southern horses, while the heavy cavalrymen used northern horses. The horses of the empire had always been smaller in size. However, they were known for their endurance. Although they weren't very good at short sprints, they were still able to endure long-distance marches. Light cavalrymen were known for their mobility on the battlefield. Thus, southern horses were the most suitable. Only the horses of the north were the type that were large in size. This type of northern horse was tall and broad in size. They were able to carry a lot of weight. Their explosive power and short-distance sprints were also a level higher than southern horses. Although they lacked endurance for long-distance sprints, they were the most suitable mounts for heavy cavalrymen. Heavy cavalrymen were known for their frontal assault. However, at this moment, it seemed that the tall and sturdy horses behind the cavalrymen were much taller than the north horses that were specially used by the heavy cavalrymen in the empire. They appeared to be extraordinarily majestic. When hundreds of horses galloped, it was as though thunder was rumbling. So many giant horses, I don't know where Shia found them from. As for these giant horses, with the exception of the saddle, they were not carrying any other weight. Thus, they were able to gallop with ease. It would appear that this cavalrymen were especially fond of these giant horses. They would rather let the heavy mules and horses die of exhaustion than let these giant horses waste their horsepower on a long-distance march. Shea stopped by the riverside and waited for a moment. Then, he heard the sound of hoof beats coming from the front. Raising his head, he saw a black horse slowly approaching. On the horse was a tall figure. He wore a black leather coat, a thick hat and collar that nearly covered half of his face. The hat was pulled down very low. However, the eyebrows that were exposed had long since been dyed white by the frost. It was Nene. Nene came before Shea and took a deep breath. Then, he said in a deep voice, "I have checked it. This ice is very solid. We can cross it. I personally rode a horse to and fro on it. There will be no problems." Shea finally let out a sigh of relief. Then, he could not help but laugh out loud. Pointing his middle finger at the sky, he said fiercely, "This damned heaven has finally let Lao Tzu off. Heaven has always given Lao Tzu all kinds of bad luck. Today, it has finally shown him some kindness. Ha ha." He lowered his head to look at Nene. Then, he said fiercely, "Give the order. All troops cross the river. Once we cross the river, we will head south. Humph. In this battle, life or death, glory or despair, it will all depend on us." The ice on the river was indeed thick. As the cavalrymen slowly crossed the river, they could hear the sound of the hooves hitting the hard ice. It was as though iron weapons were hitting each other. The 800 cavalrymen and their mounts used less than 2 hours to cross the river. After crossing the river, Xiaoya's heart, which had been in his throat, finally relaxed. He immediately shouted, "Someone come! Bring me the map!" Immediately, a personal guard placed a rolled-up map in front of him. Shea looked at it carefully and smiled. Fortunately, Lao Tzu had kept an eye on the terrain along the way when he led his men to cross the border and instigate a war between the Odin and the Corsicans. I'm afraid that old man Manninger is still dreaming of wiping out our main force in one fell swoop in the west. Let's head south and cut off his escape route. He raised his head to look at Nene and said, "Half a day's journey south is Chalk City. It is a military town in the east of Ilton County. It is close to the border with the Corsican military. It used to be a garrison in Ilton County to prevent the Corsican military from invading. Manninger is quite capable. Although the army has gone to surround Green and the others, he must have left a garrison in such an important choke point. Let's go and take out this garrison in one fell swoop. That will be the start of the first battle of this war." Nene looked at Shea and hesitated for a moment. Then, she finally said, "Actually, this time I was the one leading the team. Your body has yet to recover. Even if we were to fight, you would not be able to fight. Why take this risk?" Hearing that, Shea's heart skipped a beat. He raised his head to look at her. Although Nene's face was still expressionless, there was a trace of concern in her eyes. He sighed inwardly. Naturally, he understood that this woman still had feelings for him. For the past few days, she had been avoiding him. Every day, she would hide within the army and work hard to train the soldiers. She had spent all her energy in the army. However, now that she had met him, she was unable to suppress her feelings for him. Faced with Nene's feelings, Shea's heart was filled with an inexplicable sense of guilt. He subconsciously avoided Nene's gaze and slowly said, "This battle is a matter of life and death. Even if I were to hide in Denzel City, it would be useless. If we win, we will have a smooth road ahead. If we lose, hiding in Denzel City will also lead to my death. There is no difference between the front and the back." Seeing that Shea was avoiding her gaze, her heart darkened. After all, he is going to get married, and the wife he is going to marry is from the imperial family of the empire. She is a lonely ghost-like woman with a frightening appearance. How can she be worthy of him? She had seen that girl called Adeline before. She was indeed extraordinarily beautiful. Furthermore, she was gentle and affectionate towards Shea. She would be a good match for him. In the end, his feelings for her would not bear fruit. When she thought of that, Nene steeled her heart and forcibly suppressed those thoughts. She turned around and rode her horse to the front of the army. When it was close to noon, smoke rose from the chimneys in Chuck City. There were about 1,000 Odin troops stationed in the city, as well as 2,000 vassal troops. Most of these vassal troops were originally the surrendered troops of the Corsica military district. After the Corsica military district was annexed by Manninger, they had already surrendered to the Odins. After being scattered by Manninger, they were reorganized and placed everywhere. In such cold weather, the affiliated soldiers were not Odin's men. Naturally, they were afraid of the cold. In this damned weather, even a drop of water would freeze. Who would not want to hide in the barracks and warm themselves by the fire? However, the barbarians of the Odin were all monsters. The colder the weather, the more energetic the Odin's men became. Early in the morning, the Odin's men could be heard getting out of bed. Then, there was a lively roar for the entire morning. The Odin's men seemed to be particularly enthusiastic and happy when they saw the icy weather. In the morning, there were Odin's men in the barracks in the city. In the icy weather, they took off their clothes and grabbed the snow to wipe their bodies. Each of the Odin's men was extraordinarily strong. Their skin was red from the ice and snow. However, these guys did not seem to be afraid of the cold. Instead, they laughed more and more rudely. There were also Odin's men who wrestled in the snow for fun. They fought and quarreled non-stop for the entire morning. These Odin's men were not afraid of the cold, but they did not let the surrendered soldiers who had surrendered to them rest. The leader of the Odin's army, who was stationed here, ordered these newly affiliated soldiers to go out of the city to patrol and defend the city. He also ordered them to clean the streets in the city. These tasks fell on the unlucky affiliated soldiers. In this damned weather, people's noses would be frozen off. Who would be willing to go out to work? However, if Uncle Odin was unhappy, the whip would be mercilessly lashed out. These pitiful affiliated soldiers could only pinch their noses and bear with it. After all, the situation was better than the people. The other party was the main army now, while they were the surrendered soldiers. They were lucky to be alive. The Odin's men fought bravely, but their management was extremely crude and undisciplined. Their management was also lax. Although these affiliated soldiers were forced to come out of the warm barracks to work under the whips of the Odin's men, under such circumstances, who would really work for the Odin's men. The Odin's men were having fun in the camp, playing, wrestling, drinking, and barbecuing. Why did they have to go out of the city to patrol? In this damned weather, their armor was almost frozen. They were wrapped in thick leather jackets. When the wind blew, they would feel cold to the bones. Some of the affiliated soldiers' cavalry were sent out of the city to patrol. Once they were out of the city, they simply obeyed in public but disobeyed in private. They quietly found a leeward slope to take shelter in the wind and rest. When it was time, they would run back to the city and report that everything was fine. According to the original order, the cavalrymen who went out of the city to patrol had to send their horses 10 miles away. However, these affiliated soldiers secretly slacked off. How could they really go 10 miles away? They only went out of the city. If they could walk 2 or 3 miles, they would be considered exceptionally loyal to their duty. Damn it. Usually, they had to deal with these Odin's barbarians. If they wanted to beat them, they would beat them. If they wanted to scold them, they would scold them. After surrendering, the soldiers no longer had any pay. Every day, they could only eat some rough wheat flour. They had not seen any meat for several days. With this kind of treatment, whoever would work for the Odin's men was A.F. King's son of A.B. Tch. Under such circumstances, Shea's brigade was almost unhindered. They drove all the way to the outskirts of Chuck City. They were just a stone's throw away from the city defense. The defenders in the city did not even notice them. Smoke from the kitchen chimneys was faintly rising in the city. Looking around, the city walls were not considered tall. There were no defenders at all. They were probably huddled under the walls to take shelter from the wind. The city gates were wide open. A few unlucky fellows were left at the gates to clean up the snow. This small city did not seem to have the slightest bit of defense. Shea's entire army was just a few hundred meters away from the city. Behind a hillside, the black mass of cavalrymen had finished forming up. All the cavalrymen had dismounted from their horses and were nervously putting on their armor. It was not an easy thing to put on the heavy full-body armor. The cavalrymen could only help each other and nervously move. Shea was already standing on the hillside. His fur coat had been dyed white by the frost. Standing on the hillside, he seemed to have merged with the surrounding ice and snow. Even if someone looked at him from afar, if they did not look carefully, they would not be able to see that there was a person standing there. Shea looked at the smoke rising in the city. He touched his chin and smiled. Ha! What a coincidence! The fellows in the city are about to have lunch. Pass down the order, we will act according to plan. Before noon, we will annihilate these fellows and then enter the city to eat. He turned his head and looked at the cavalry army under his command at the foot of the hill. At this moment, the troops had finally finished their preparations. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were tightly fixed on Shea. Shea's face was grave and stern as he shouted, "I have invested a lot in this cavalry army of ours. I have practically emptied my family's savings to provide for you. Today is your first battle after forming the army. I will watch from here. I want to see you fight a beautiful victory for Lao Tzu with my own eyes." As he spoke, Shea took down a bugle from his waist. He crushed the frozen ice on it and stood on the hillside, blowing it with all his might. In an instant, the deep bugle broke the peace of the land. I have finally recovered. After returning home from the hospital last night, I slept soundly until this morning. Finally, I don't need to be on a drip anymore. Over the past few days, he had been in a daze almost every day. His fever had turned into pneumonia, which had become a joke. He was already so old, yet he still contracted pneumonia like a child. When he woke up this morning, he felt much better. He actually got out of bed at 6 o'clock and started typing. He felt a little rusty. However, since his body had recovered, from today onwards, he would officially return to his normal speed. From today onwards, at least until the Spring Festival, I guarantee that there will be updates every day. I also apologize to everyone who is waiting for the update. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 455. In Chuck City, Odin's soldiers were playing around for fun, while the vassal army was slacking off. Originally, the atmosphere could be considered harmonious. Suddenly, the sound of a bugle call came from outside the city. Surprisingly, it was the Byzantine army's signal to assemble. Immediately, the peace in the city was shattered. Although the Odin's army was a bit rough and disorderly, their valiant fighting instincts were not forgotten. Upon hearing the bugle call, the leader's expression changed and he immediately shouted loudly. The Odin's soldiers who were still playing around immediately stopped. They stopped drinking wine and eating meat. The Odin's warriors who were still rubbing their bodies with ice and snow also hurriedly ran back into the barracks. Although it was a bit chaotic, under the leader's hurried whistle, almost all of the Odin's soldiers rushed out and began to form up. When the Odin's soldiers fought, they had never paid much attention to battle tactics or formations. They didn't even care much about equipment. The Odin's empire was located in the north and was bitterly cold. Their resources were scarce and they had never been known for their elite soldiers. Like the Byzantine army, using elite iron tools to forge armor in the Odin's army was simply an extravagant act. The Odin's soldiers had always been proud of their individual bravery. If an Odin's soldiers were to fight, even if they were bare-chested, as long as they carried a heavy axe, they would dare to charge into the Byzantium's army. The Odin's soldiers were born with a natural racial talent. Their physique was much stronger than the Byzantium's. Most of them were tough and burly warriors. In the eyes of the Odin's soldiers, the Byzantium soldiers were nothing more than a group of sheep who relied on their family's wealth to arm themselves with elite weapons and armor. In terms of true ability, how could the Byzantium soldiers be a match for the Odin's warriors? Historically, in terms of individual combat strength, a single Odin's soldier could easily defeat 3 Byzantium soldiers. At this moment, although the Byzantine army's battle cry sounded outside the city, the Odin's soldiers inside the city were shocked but not afraid. However, many of them couldn't help but wonder, didn't they hear that the Byzantium's army was fighting against Patriarch Maninger's main forces in the west? Why did the Byzantine army come here? But whether they came or not, the Odin's soldiers thought, who cares since they're here, let's give them a good beating. In their bones, the Odin's soldiers looked down on the Byzantium soldiers. As for the surrendered vassal soldiers in the city, they looked down on them even more. Now that they were about to fight, if it was a smart general, they would probably throw the surrendered soldiers out as cannon fodder. Whether they could win or not, at least they could probe the enemy's strength first. Even if they could consume a little of the enemy's strength, it would still be good. But the pride of these Odin's soldiers was deeply rooted in their bones. At this moment, they didn't have the slightest bit of such thoughts. When they were about to fight, they didn't care about the vassal soldiers at all. They just gathered in their own ranks and rushed out of the city to meet the enemy under the command of their leader. Maninger attached great importance to Chuck City. It was a place that could overlook the Corsica military region. Its geographical location was also quite important. After all, the Corsica military region had just been annexed by him. Many places were still unstable. Once there was any unrest, the garrison here could immediately be dispatched to quell the rebellion. Therefore, of the 1,000 Odin's soldiers stationed in Chuck City, 500 of them were cavalrymen, and all of them were Odin's elite reindeer cavalrymen. At this moment, after the Odin's soldiers rushed out of the city, they saw an army with the banner of the Byzantine army on the opposite side. They were already lined up in the wilderness outside the city. When the Odin's commander saw this, he couldn't help but feel angry and despise them. He was also a veteran of the Odin's army and was used to fighting in wars. From his experience, the enemy army didn't seem to be large. Based on his experience, there were at most 1,000 cavalrymen. Although they were cavalrymen, he had 500 Odin's elite reindeer cavalrymen under his command. Why would he care about the less than 1,000 Byzantium cavalrymen? Historically, in the hearts of the Odin's people, the only army in the Byzantium army that could go head-to-head with their own elite army was the Rhodria cavalry. The rest of the armies were nothing to them. Under normal circumstances, the 500 Odin's reindeer cavalrymen would dare to face 1,000 Byzantium cavalrymen head-on. Moreover, they would be able to defeat the enemy's formation and emerge victorious. Moreover, it was currently winter. These weak Byzantium soldiers would have to be crazy to fight Odin's soldiers in this kind of weather. The Odin's commander smiled proudly. He had already ordered his cavalrymen to get into formation and prepare to charge. He wanted to defeat this ignorant Byzantine army with a single charge. In his mind, there was no need to think about the outcome of this battle. The only problem was how to pursue the enemy after defeating them. At this moment, the Byzantine army's horn finally stopped. The Byzantium army only had a few hundred cavalrymen lined up in formation. However, it was completely silent. The horses did not neigh, and the men did not shout. It was so quiet that it made one's hair stand on end. Only the armor on the cavalryman's body emitted a cold light under the reflection of the ice and snow. It was so cold that it was blinding. A strong black horse dashed out from one side of the formation and ran around the front of the cavaliers of Byzantine. Finally, it stopped in the middle of the formation. On the back of the horse there was a white cloak, and under the cloak there was a heavy metal armor. It was dash. Nene took a deep breath and gently lowered the visor on her helmet. She knocked an arrow on her bow, shio. A wolf-fang arrow was shot into the center of the battlefield between the two armies. When the Odin soldiers saw this, they immediately started to clamor. Many of the Odin soldiers were furious, and some of them even cursed loudly. It turned out that Nene's action was a common gesture used by both armies. When the commanders of the two armies faced each other, especially the cavalrymen, shooting an arrow into the center of the battlefield was a standard invitation to battle. What he meant was, let's not waste any more words. Everyone, get into formation and charge head-on. Let's see who's tougher. The Odin's soldiers had always looked down on the Byzantium army. They only felt that the Byzantine army was mostly defensive in formation and would be beaten into a turtle by the charge of the Odin's soldiers. However, they did not expect the commander of the Byzantine army to be so daring. He actually dared to issue a challenge. Two armies facing each other? The Odin soldiers were clamoring, and the commander's fighting spirit was ignited. After a few roars, he immediately ordered the cavalrymen to gather in the center from the two wings and get into a charging stance. Daring is daring. However, I will let you Byzantium sheep see that courage alone is useless. In the Byzantine Empire, apart from the Rhodria cavalry, no other army dared to fight head-on with the Odin's soldiers. On the battlefield, the two armies slowly retreated and pulled apart the distance between them. The cavalrymen of both sides slowly gathered and got into formation. At this moment it was noon. The sky that had been gloomy for the entire morning suddenly scattered a rare ray of sunlight through the gaps between the dark clouds. This ray of sunlight seemed to have come from the thick layers of dark clouds and landed in the center of the battlefield. The golden sunlight shone on the white land of ice and snow, giving off a strange feeling. Both armies had finished organizing their horses. At this moment, a horn sounded from the Byzantine army's side. The vanguard of the army let out a low roar and charged forward. The hundreds of cavalrymen behind him formed a standard arrow formation of the Empire's heavy cavalry. Their hooves thundered as they charged forward. At the Odin's side, the commander also let out a roar. All of the Odin's soldiers let out an angry roar, and the reindeer cavalrymen also charged forward. The hundreds of reindeer cavalrymen charging together was indeed shocking. Reindeer mounts were originally more majestic than the war horses of the Byzantium. The weight and charging strength of reindeer mounts were also greater than the war horses of the Byzantium. The weight and strength of the reindeer cavalrymen were naturally 3 times stronger than the horses of the Byzantine Empire. Reindeer cavalrymen had always been the sharpest weapon of the Odin's army. Although the Odin's cavalrymen were at a disadvantage in terms of numbers, with 500 cavalrymen, even if they met 3 times the number of Byzantium cavalrymen, they would still be able to take them down. In the wilderness outside the city, the cavalrymen of both sides were like 2 torrents, charging forward from 2 different directions. The sound of galloping hooves shook the heavens and earth. White snowflakes flew across the wilderness. The snow on the ground was kicked up by the hooves of the reindeer and horses. The cavalrymen of both sides were like 2 streams of iron, finally meeting in the middle of the battlefield and fiercely colliding. Instantly, sparks flew in all directions. Amidst the rumbling sounds, the cavalrymen of both sides had already fiercely collided. Only the sounds of men and horses being thrown off their feet could be heard. The sounds of weapons clashing, the muffled sounds of soldiers falling off their horses, the sounds of blunt weapons smashing into people, and the miserable cries of soldiers being trampled by horses, both sides did not hold back at all. This kind of direct confrontation had no room for trickery. What they were competing for was true combat strength. But in the instant the 2 torrents collided, the eyeballs of the Odin's army behind them almost fell out of their sockets. It was as if the pride of the Odin's army had been shattered in an instant. The cavalrymen of both sides fiercely collided. In the first wave of collision, the front line was filled with figures falling off their horses. But what made the eyeballs of the Odin's army almost fall out of their sockets was that the ones falling off their horses were all Odin's reindeer cavalrymen. In the instant of the collision, the seemingly majestic flood of Odin's reindeer cavalrymen charging at the front line was viciously torn apart by the Byzantium cavalrymen's charge. The front row of Odin's reindeer cavalrymen didn't even have time to cry out in pain as they fell off their horses. The Byzantium cavalrymen were like an indestructible hammer as they fiercely smashed into the front line of Odin's reindeer cavalrymen. Amidst the rumbling sounds of hooves, the Byzantium cavalrymen's charge crashed into the Odin's reindeer cavalrymen. The pitiful reindeer cavalrymen were like paper under the charge of the Byzantium cavalrymen, easily smashed into pieces. Over 100 cavalrymen, half of them fell off their horses in a single charge. The rest of them were quickly swallowed by the charge of the cavaliers of Byzantine behind them. This Byzantium cavalry was simply inhumanly strong. Those overly majestic warhorses were several times stronger than the reindeer cavalrymen. The cavalrymen on their backs were fully clad in iron armor and wielded heavy weapons. The scariest thing was that even the horses were covered in armor. Every single one of the cavalrymen was like a moving steel fortress. What was even scarier was that with such a huge load, an ordinary warhorse would have already been crushed to the ground. However, those Byzantium warhorses were still able to gallop as if they were flying. With such a huge load and charging at such a high speed, the impact was not something that humans could withstand. Hundreds of these abnormal heavy cavalry soldiers charged over in a dense formation. It was as if a steel wall was fiercely pressing down on them. The reindeer cavalrymen that Odin's people were so proud of were instantly crushed. Every single one of these Byzantium cavalrymen was excessively brave and fierce. Every single one of the Odin's soldiers in the rear saw an inconceivable scene. When the Byzantium heavy cavalrymen at the front rammed into their own reindeer cavalrymen, those enormous warhorses were like steel fortresses ramming into them. The reindeer cavalrymen in front of them were sent flying in an instant. The Odin soldiers on their backs were knocked to the ground without making a sound. Even the reindeer cavalrymen on their backs were knocked down by the cavalrymen along with their horses. Such a powerful impact, other than the word perverted, there was no other way to describe it. The pitiful Odin's people had always been known for their strength and bravery. However, every single one of these Byzantium cavalrymen were more like Odin's people than Odin's people. Every single one of these cavalrymen seemed to possess boundless strength. Whether it was the degree of their majesty or the degree of their bravery, even the Odin's people felt their hairs stand on end. These cavalrymen were like lumps of metal with such heavy armor on their back. However, when they charged, those heavy hammers in their hands could still be swung rapidly. While riding on their horses, they could still swing their hammers left and right. Every single one of the Odin's people who were struck by the hammers had their bones broken and tendons snapped. If they were struck in the head, their brains would instantly burst open and their large heads would become like watermelons smashed by hammers. There were even some who saw the Byzantium cavalrymen swinging their hammers and sending the Odin's cavalrymen flying back several meters before landing on the ground. Such strength! How could an ordinary cavalryman possess such strength? In one exchange, the 500 Odin's reindeer cavalrymen that had charged forward were practically smashed apart in one exchange. It was so fast that it left one speechless. It was so fast that it was too much for the eyes to take in. It was so fast that the Odin's infantry behind were filled with grief and indignation, because in one exchange their cavalrymen were completely smashed apart. The rumbling of the horse hooves was already right in front of their noses. Their own reindeer cavalrymen were defeated too quickly. So quickly that they did not even give the Odin's infantry any time to prepare. The heavy cavaliers of Byzantine charged forward like a flood, and they didn't stop for even a second. Although the rest of the Odin's infantry were already in formation, when the Byzantium cavalrymen charged forward, several holes were instantly smashed open. The charging power of these cavalrymen was truly astonishing. The front row of cavalrymen rammed into the formation of Odin's infantry. In an instant, one cavalryman charged into the formation, and several Odin's soldiers were sent flying backwards. Some had their bones shattered from the impact, while others did not even have the chance to scream before they died with blood spurting out from their noses and mouths. The Odin's soldiers that had always been known for their brute strength and valiance were like paper in front of these cavalrymen. The cavalrymen charged into the formation of Odin's infantry. With just one charge, they directly pierced through the formation of Odin's soldiers. The Odin's soldiers could only put up a last-ditch struggle, resisting with all their might. However, what made the Odin's soldiers despair was that the bravery that they had always relied on was completely useless in front of this enemy. The valiant warriors in their army brandished their battle axes and hammers, but they were easily knocked back by the enemy. Then, they were smashed into smithereens along with their weapons. Some Odin's soldiers, on the verge of death, brandished their battle axes in an attempt to perish together with the enemy. However, the cavalrymen on horseback only glanced at them with cold gazes. When the cavalrymen smashed down with their hammers, the Odin's soldiers were as frail as withered twigs. Their weapons were broken, and their bodies were immediately sent flying. Before they even landed on the ground, they were already dead. This terrifyingly powerful cavalry only used one charge to completely crush the 1,000 Odin's soldiers. The degree of ease was like a brawl between a giant man and a toddler. From the beginning to the end of the battle, only a few moments had passed. The Byzantium cavalrymen had already begun to clean up the battlefield. The cavalrymen quickly split into several small groups to chase down the defeated Odin's soldiers. Some even slowed down their horses and turned back to search along the way. If there were any Odin's soldiers who were still alive, they would immediately give them a blow with their hammers. This was no longer a battle, but a massacre. The battle was nearing its end. The Byzantium cavalrymen on the battlefield split into small groups to clean up the rear. On the city walls, the surrendered soldiers of the vassal army were completely dumbfounded. The battle just now had almost completely shattered everything they knew in their hearts. The Odin's army that had always been known for their valiance was actually easily crushed by a Byzantine army in a head-on clash without any tricks. What was even more frightening was that the Odin's army had lost so thoroughly and so miserably. They did not even have the slightest ability to fight back. Just when they had yet to recover from their shock, this mysterious and insanely powerful Byzantium cavalryman had already entered the city. Without any orders or hesitation, the surrendered soldiers of the vassal army on the city walls ran down in groups in a sorry state. They threw away the weapons in their hands and knelt by the side of the road. The battle just now had chilled them to the bone. Seeing the cavalrymen enter the city, not a single soldier of the vassal army dared to look up at the cavalryman on horseback. This is not a cavalryman. This is simply hundreds of killing gods. Shea entered the city at the very back of the group, surrounded by more than a dozen personal guards. The battle just now was so easy that even Shea himself was stunned. This cavalry was built by him single-handedly, almost emptying his family's assets to build it. He had long known that this cavalry was very strong, but after all, they had not fought in actual combat. Even Shea himself did not think that this cavalry would be so strong. 800 against 1,000, one charge was enough to completely destroy the enemy. And the opponent was not some random mob, but the elite Odin's Scarlet Snow army. Even if an adult fought against a Boy Scout, it would not be so easy, right? When Shea rode into the city, he could clearly feel the deep reverence of the surrendered vassal army kneeling on both sides. Damn it, Lao Tzu has underestimated his own strength. With such a strong army, even if they meet Manninger's main force, they can still ruthlessly kill him. Looks like this plan has to be adjusted a little. After easily occupying the Odin's barracks in the city, Shea immediately made arrangements. He only sent less than 50 cavalrymen to collect the surrendered vassal army. The rest of the troops, except for those who pursued Odin outside the city and those who cleaned up the battlefield, entered the Odin's barracks. In the barracks, the smoke from Odin's cooking hadn't dissipated yet. There was still steaming hot food in the pot. There was meat broth that had been boiled to a pulp, and beef and sheep that had been roasted until crispy. Shea's men and horses had cheaply gotten these. The morale of the entire army was high. Sure enough, Shea did not expect that even these cavalrymen did not expect that this battle would be won so easily. Their own strength had far exceeded their own expectations. When the number of casualties was reported to Shea was even more stunned. 800 cavalrymen fought against 1,000 Odin's elites, and the final number of casualties was actually not a single one from his side. Only 30 or so were injured, and all of them were minor injuries. They only managed to break the enemy's ranks when the cavalrymen charged. However, the battlefield was littered with the corpses of Odin's men and the reindeer. In the end, their horses were injured because they tripped over them. Even though Shea had already made an optimistic estimate, his eyeballs nearly fell out of their sockets when he saw this ratio. Damn it, Lao Tzu really invested a lot. This return is 2F** king amazing. He sucked in a breath of cold air. However, he immediately heard Dora's voice in his mind. Kid, don't be so complacent. This cavalry that you created should not exist in this world. Such an excessively strong force would most likely bring about a lot of trouble in the future. Don't be happy too early. Shea was silent for a moment. Finally, he sighed. That's right. This cavalry should not exist in this world. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 456. GOR Chapter 432 The Death of a Man 1 Shea was well aware of that. This battle was a soul-stirring one and they won it to their heart's content. The combat power of these 800 mounted soldiers was so strong that it defied the heavens, almost to the point of being abnormal. However, there was no way for him to create another squad of these 800 mounted soldiers. The reason for that was none other than what Dora had said. Such a mounted force should not exist in this world. The amount of money that Shea had invested in the creation of these 800 powerful mounted soldiers was so extravagant that it was close to incurring the wrath of the heavens. If one wanted to know how Shea's subordinates managed to create such an unfathomably powerful army, they would have to start from the beginning. A few months ago, when Merlin came to Denzel City, Shea's peaceful days were shattered by this abnormal adoptive mother of his. The most unfortunate part was that Merlin had gotten used to ordering around Todoro. When it came to endurance, obedience and flattery, Todoro could be considered as the number one amongst Shea's subordinates. Todoro's fear of Merlin was deeply engraved into his bones. His reverence towards Merlin was perhaps 30%, but his fear was 70%. Under Merlin's tyrannical abuse, the poor Todoro had to live in an abyss of suffering every day. As for Merlin, despite his eccentric and irritable temperament, he was still very concerned about Shea. That was especially true when Todoro accidentally revealed some of Shea's secrets. That was especially true when it came to the horse carriage that Shea had hidden in the garrison mansion. What was inside the horse carriage? Those were the treasures that Shea had plundered from the underground palace of the ancient gnomes with Hastings. They were the treasures that the ancient gnomes had created. Among them, Shea had already developed the Battle Tree Fortress on the battlefield. The first time it was used, it made Odin's people suffer a lot, and it also made Todoro, the white-robed archmage, famous. In addition to the Fortress of Trees, Shea had found another important item in the ruins of the ancient gnomes. It was the mussel fruit. The mussel fruit was one of the most important research results of the ancient gnomes. One had to know that in ancient times, the gnomes were a class above many other races. They possessed intelligent minds and the most developed civilization. However, the innate racial flaw could not be erased. Those intelligent ancient gnomes, in addition to devoting themselves to the Creation God project, had also been painstakingly researching how to make up for their racial innate defects. One of the most important things was to make up for the combat strength of the goblins. The natural physique of the goblins was much weaker than that of other races. Not to mention the dragon race, which had the strongest physique, they were also far inferior to the dwarves and the elves. Compared to the human race, which was not known for their physique, the goblins' physique was too weak. In battle, the goblin warriors were short in stature. Their stamina and strength were definitely inferior in all aspects. If they were to go to war with other races, they would be at a huge disadvantage just in terms of physical combat, not to mention other things. Although the goblins had the most advanced weapons, they even had powerful gadgets like the magic cannons. However, making up for the innate defects of their physique had always been the research direction of the clever scholars among the goblins. Under such circumstances, the development of the mussel fruit was a major breakthrough in this field for the goblins. Shea had heard Hastings introduce the use of the mussel fruit before. It was really a treasure for close combat. After using the mussel fruit, the user's strength and combat strength in all aspects would increase exponentially. Moreover, it could achieve an effect similar to berserk in battle. When the user received damage, they could burst forth with even more power. The more they fought, the stronger they would become. It could be said that if the mussel fruit was used properly, it could cultivate a group of outstanding elite warriors who were good at careful close combat. After being transformed by the mussel fruit, the strength and stamina of such a warrior would increase by several times. Moreover, during battle, they would be able to burst forth with astonishing potential. The only side effect was that if too much was used, it would exceed the limits of the implanted individual's endurance and cause the implanted individual's body to collapse. After Shea obtained these mussel fruits, He had carefully thought about how to make full use of these treasures to achieve the greatest efficiency. After careful research, he realized a problem. The mussel fruit was something that the ancient goblins had researched. The goblins were born with weak physique. If the goblin's physique was used as the basis, the limits of these mussel fruits would naturally be very low. However, humans were born with stronger physiques than the goblins. Therefore, if the mussel fruit was used as a basis, it was obvious that the limits of endurance would be much higher than the goblins. Different individuals' foundations could lead to different results. Then, if the implanted target's physique was stronger than a human's, would the effects be better after using the mussel fruit? Shea's mind was very agile. He quickly came up with a bold idea. There were only 40 or so mussel fruits that he had plundered. It must be known that the ancient goblins had spent a lot of effort and painstaking effort to finally come up with these few things. It could be said that they were the crystallization of the entire clan's strength. Just when Shea was having a headache about how to use these things, Merlin appeared. After torturing Todoro and learning about Shea's personal collection from Shea, Merlin, who was almost the top master level in magic research, immediately intervened and helped Shea a lot. For Merlin, she was extremely interested in the results of the ancient goblins' research. This was the instinct of an outstanding wizard. These things immediately became her favorite toys. She quickly dissected a mussel fruit in her own magic lab and did a thorough research on it. Then, during the first experiment, Merlin personally went to the wildfire field to capture a few strong magical beasts as test subjects. Shea witnessed the process of the first experiment with his own eyes. An adult lion with a majestic and strong body was the sacrifice of the first experiment. This type of magical beast was known for its strong body and great strength. Its claws and teeth were sharp and could tear apart the armor of a warrior. An adult lion could easily tear an elephant twice its size into pieces. Merlin refined a mussel fruit into a small bottle of magic liquid. For the first experiment, the adult lion ingested only a few drops. As a result, Shea witnessed with his own eyes that the lion used for the experiment immediately changed. This violent beast's body began to swell in a short period of time. The bones and muscles of its originally strong body began to swell at a speed visible to the naked eye. It became thicker and more solid. Then, this guy that was locked in the cage suddenly went crazy. It easily tore the cage made of iron bars that were as thick as an arm and ran out. It caused quite a big accident and almost injured a few guards in the garrison mansion. In the end, after killing this magical beast, Merlin used a few days to completely understand this item and found the best dilution ratio. Then, Shea made a choice. If he used the mussel fruit directly on a human, it might be able to increase a person's body and strength by several folds. However, due to the fact that humans were not considered a strong race in the first place, due to the limitations of their base numbers, the rate of growth was not very good. Merlin had said that even if he used it on a powerful warrior who had gone through harsh physical training, his body would only be able to increase his physical strength by about 3 times. Any more and it would cause side effects. The body would not be able to withstand the limit of strengthening and it would cause the body to collapse. After some consideration, Shea came up with a bold idea. If he used it on a human, the effect would not be too good. Then, if he wanted to fully utilize the value of this item, why not use it on a warhorse? The strength of a warhorse was naturally much stronger than that of a human. Additionally, for a mounted soldier, almost 70% of a mounted soldier's battle prowess came from his mount. After consuming the magic liquid extracted from the mussel fruit, a warhorse that was already very strong would become a terrifying mount. Originally, a warhorse could carry up to a few hundred gen of weight. After the upgrade, the strength, endurance, and toughness of the muscles and bones of the warhorse had increased exponentially. A strengthened warhorse could carry up to 1,000 gen of weight, yet it could still run as if it was flying, charging back and forth. Coupled with the strengthening of the warhorse's physique, its muscles and bones had become thicker and sturdier. The size and volume of the warhorse had also increased greatly. A strengthened warhorse, coupled with its own weight and the powerful driving force, charged forward at full strength. Even Shea's eyes couldn't help but turn red from the impact. Through Merlin's careful calculations and Shea's careful selection in the dark. Thus, he began his plan. According to Merlin's formula and the dilution ratio, the 40 muscle fruits that Shea had plundered would only be enough to arm a few hundred cavalrymen at most if they were all refined and fed to the warhorses and men. Shea began selecting men from the mounted soldiers under his command. The thousands of mounted soldiers under his command were almost all elite. A portion of them were the bandits that Nene had led earlier, while the other portion were the remaining elites of the Roadrear cavalry. It would not be an exaggeration to say that any one of them, placed in any other army, would be a first-rate elite. However, Shea's selection this time was one of excellence. He had selected those mounted soldiers with exceptionally strong bodies. Under the strengthening effect of the muscle fruit, their physique was the most important foundation. In this way, some people who were lacking in strength but had outstanding skills were eliminated. Shea blindly selected those with bodies as strong as bulls. In just one breath, he had selected nearly 1,000 men. Most of them were from the Roadrear cavalry. After all, the Roadrear cavalry was the elite cavalry corps of the Empire. The soldiers of the Roadrear Cavalry Corps were already the cream of the crop. Then, there was the selection of warhorses. Shea had practically emptied out his entire fortune. He did not have enough warhorses to begin with. Back then, when Reinhardt had brought over thousands of mounted soldiers to join him, they had already reached the end of their road by the time they made the long journey to Denzel City. Many of the mounted soldiers were riding on mules that they had snatched along the way or the reindeer from Odin's men. He did not have enough warhorses to begin with. Shea was ruthless and he went all out. He spent a hefty sum to order his men to gather warhorses. The gold that he had obtained from the trade with the Zakudi people had been thrown out in large quantities. Dax, the spy of the Lantis kingdom, had been used to the extreme. For several months, Dax had been running around for him, secretly contacting various chambers of commerce on the mainland to purchase military equipment and smuggle warhorses for him to use. Thus, after frantically plundering and carefully selecting the warhorses in his army, Shea was finally able to gather the number that he needed. Shea did not keep a single one of the 40 muscle fruits that the ancient gnomes had produced. With Merlin's help, the magic liquid was refined and Shea was able to create 800 elite cavalrymen that could make one's hair stand on end. The warhorses of these mounted soldiers were strengthened mounts. The strength and impact of their mounts were at least 3 times stronger than an ordinary warhorse. The mounted soldiers themselves were also valiant warriors that had been strengthened. After their physiques were strengthened, even if they were carrying hundreds of kilograms of heavy armor and weapons, they would still be able to fight with ease. The valiant war horses and the valiant cavalry warriors were combined together, and there were 800 of them. This was the first time that such a small cavalry unit had entered the battlefield, and they immediately displayed their valiant and peerless might. Even the initiator of this, Shea himself, was shocked by the alternative that he had created. 800 mounted soldiers were able to sweep away the Odin elites that outnumbered them. Moreover, their own injuries were negligible. There was no doubt that they had an overwhelming advantage in the battle. With such a valiant army, if he could create a few thousand mounted soldiers, then he would be able to easily sweep the world. Even if tens of thousands of enemy troops were to form a tight formation in a field battle, they would still be unable to resist this valiant cavalry that did not belong to this world. Unfortunately, Shea was also very clear that it was impossible for him to create more of these mounted soldiers. In order to strengthen these 800 mounted soldiers, the muscle fruits had almost been used up. And these things were researched and created by the ancient gnomes. In this era, it was simply impossible to create them again. What Shea did not know was that the 40 over muscle fruits were also created by the ancient gnomes. Such an intelligent race had gathered a large amount of investment from the entire race and the wisdom of countless gnome scholars at great cost to create them. There was only so much left in the inventory, but it all ended up benefiting Shea, and this prodigal had used them all up without batting an eyelid. Even if the ancient gnomes were still around, they would not have the ability to create so many muscle fruits again. Was that not the case? The creation god area of the ancient gnome race had condensed the most extraordinary wisdom scholars of the entire race for hundreds of years. The efforts of countless elites, who knew how much manpower and material resources had been invested, and how many precious and rare materials had been spent to create this little thing. But he, Uncle Shea, had used it all up so easily with just a thought. It must be known that even the ancient gnomes did not really use these muscle fruits for the gnome warriors. After capturing Chuck City, Shea ordered the cavalry under his command to rest for only half a day. The soldiers had a full meal, and there were naturally stockpiled supplies in the city. The war horses were also supplemented with excellent fodder. Shea immediately gave the order to set fire to the city. Naturally, none of the 2,000 surrendered soldiers in the city dared to stand up and resist. These guys were already scared out of their wits by Odin's people. Now that they had encountered an army stronger and fiercer than Odin's people, how could they have the slightest thought of resistance? Their attitude was 10 times more docile than when they faced Odin's people. Shea gave the order to set fire to the small city. Even without his people doing anything, the surrendered soldiers took the initiative to do the work. In the evening, the small city was already a raging fire. The warehouses and fodder fields in the city were already burning, and thick smoke billowed into the sky. When night fell, such fire could be seen dozens of miles away. Shea and the others had already left the city. The whole army was lined up on the hillside outside the city, ready to go. Shea looked at the fire in the city in the distance, and suddenly smiled. "This is a signal to Manninger. We're here. This time, we're going to turn the inner region of his Ilton County upside down. The bigger the trouble we cause, the safer Green and the others who are confronting them at the front line." He asked the people around him to bring him a map. After a few glances, his face was cold. "All troops, let's go. We'll travel through the night and continue to head south. Burn the city when we see it, slaughter the town when we see it. Wherever we go, if there's any trace of Odin's people, there's only one word to say: kill." Just as the situation in Ilton County was becoming more and more complicated, the city of Osgilla in the far south had become like a barrel filled with gunpowder, ready to explode at any moment. The sky had not yet brightened, but the chaotic warfare in the city that had been going on for many days finally seemed to be coming to a halt. The houses and houses that had been burning for many days were gradually being extinguished. The soldiers who had been carrying swords and sabers, their faces ferocious and greedy as they looted everywhere for the past few days, were gradually being recalled by the troops of the various military regions. A little order seemed to have been restored in the city. However, from the direction of the Arc de Triomphe and the Imperial Palace, the sound of war drums and bugles could still be heard from time to time. The sounds of fighting seemed to be getting more and more urgent, from morning till night. In a rundown street in the west of the city, which was originally a neighborhood where the rich lived, several groups of rebel soldiers had been tormenting this place for the past 2 days. After the owners were done looting, the owners came back to loot. Several groups of rebel soldiers even had small skirmishes over this fertile land of wealth. In the end, it seemed that everyone had finally agreed on a way to divide the loot. A few families took turns to loot from house to house in the nearby street. From morning till night, the screams and wails of the residents who had been attacked by the rebels could be heard. In a house in the west corner of this neighborhood, the main door had been kicked down long ago. 2 pieces of rotten door planks hung in front of the door, revealing a large hole. There were bloodstains on the steps outside the door. Several arrows and 2 or 3 broken swords were scattered on the ground. There were also several corpses at the door. They looked like the residents of the city. Presumably, they had been killed by the rebels. The original resident of this house was a wealthy merchant. At that moment, the entire family was nowhere to be seen. It was unknown if the entire family had met with a disaster or if the entire family had fled to another place to hide. The courtyard beyond the main door was littered with things that had been turned upside down. Broken boxes, furniture, plants and pots and pans that had been kicked over. The doors and windows of several houses had been smashed. Several waves of rebel soldiers had visited this place. This small house of affluence had been emptied out. Nothing of value was left behind. Even the copper nails on some of the door planks had been gouged out by the rebel soldiers. If one were to stand on the street and look inside the broken door, one would find that it was dark inside. There was also a stench. It was unknown if it was the stench of something knocked over or if it was the stench of corpses. It was a complete mess. It was obvious that this was a place that had been plundered clean. Even if there were rebel soldiers with swords and sabers passing by occasionally, they would not be interested in going in to plunder after taking a look inside the house. Anyone could tell at a glance that there was no more profit to be gained from this place. At this moment, in Osgilla City, almost every street had a place like this that was deserted and looked like a haunted house. The imperial capital, which had been prosperous for hundreds of years, had lost all the wealth and vitality that it had accumulated over hundreds of years in the chaos caused by the rebel army's invasion. It snowed the day before yesterday on this huge street. Naturally, no one would clean up the accumulated snow. At night, some residents in ragged clothes began to walk out of the street in fear. On the street, they used pots and other utensils to collect the accumulated snow. They would go back to melt it and boil it for drinking. As for food, it was probably gone long ago. This house was still deserted. Passers-by who saw the corpses at the door would instinctively take a few steps away and stay far away from the door. In this haunted house, in a dark house, there was a pair of eyes behind the broken window sill. At this moment there was a pair of eyes. Through the window sill, they stared closely at the direction of the door, vigilantly looking at the occasional passers-by or rebel soldiers passing by. It was only when the sky was completely dark that the vigilance in those eyes finally subsided a little. A 1,000-year-old imperial capital has been ruined to this extent. Whether it's Hughes or Salvador, they don't even have the ability to manage an army. It serves them right for not being able to achieve great things. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 457. GOR Chapter 432 Death of a Man 2. A plump figure emerged from the house under the cover of the night. Despite his bloated appearance, his movements were surprisingly sharp. He ran across the snowy ground within the courtyard like a nimble cat. Roar leaned forward and shoved 2 handfuls of snow into his mouth. Next, he used the heat from his mouth to melt the snow. Then, he slowly swallowed the snow into his stomach. Throughout the entire process, his head was raised and his eyes were vigilant as he stared at the door. His ears were also attentively listening for any movements caused by the wind. Behind him, there were also 2 figures who quietly followed him. They used the basins in their hands to carefully gather the snow. Then, the 3 of them quietly returned to the house. The house had long since been empty. After entering the house, they passed through a side door and arrived at the backyard. The 3 of them then walked into a large house. It was a warehouse. They lifted up a thick wooden plank on the ground to reveal a cellar. A faint light shone out from the cellar. The moment the plank was lifted up, 2 sharp swords emerged from below. Fatso gave a light smile and whispered, "It's me." The swords were quickly retracted. Then, someone said in a muffled voice, "Sir has returned." Roar crouched down and slipped into the cellar. Then, he shook off the snow on his body and sighed. "It's warmer down here." The cellar was originally a place for the rich families to store their items. During the winter, they stored food. During the summer, they could also store ice. It was quite a spacious place. At that moment, there were over 100 men inside the cellar. They were dressed in various ways and they were either seated or fighting. They formed a circle around the cellar. It was just that there was only one candle. Roar walked down and looked at the men beside him. He smiled and said, "There won't be any problems today. There are still 2 brothers outside keeping watch. Everyone, get some rest. When dawn comes, we'll go out and do another 2. After he said that, someone quickly said, "Sir, those rebels are useless. They are just a pile of trash. We have been sneaking around for the past few days and have killed over 100 of them. However, how can we save the city with such petty actions? Why don't we find a rebel stronghold and wipe them out in one go? As long as he could get enough horses. Our brothers are 100 cavalrymen. In this city, he could do whatever he wanted. Killing our way into the imperial palace to save the emperor or going to the Arc de Triomphe to reinforce General Adric is also a good idea. It's better than hiding here and secretly killing a few stragglers, right?" As soon as this person spoke, there were immediately other people who couldn't help but agree. Hearing this, Roar chuckled. He just raised his hand and pressed down. The cellar immediately quieted down. The 100 or so prideful and valiant warriors in front of him, however, respected General Fatso to the bone. "I know that all of you have been holding back for a long time. That day when the city was breached, I gathered all of you here because all of you wanted to go into battle and kill the enemy. I naturally understand. At this moment, the city is filled with rebel soldiers. Truth be told, although they have a lot of people, I think most of them are just a motley crew. How could they be a match for our Rodrier cavalry? As long as we are given enough warhorses, we can charge forward in formation. Even if there are 10 times more rebel soldiers, they will not be able to stop us. On this point, Lao Tzu is very confident." Ha 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 ha. Hearing that, the people around him laughed and said, that's right. In a head-on battle, who in this Byzantium could be stronger than us Rodriers?" "That's right." Roar nodded his head. Then, his tone changed and he said in a serious tone, "However, given the current situation, although I know of your bravery and loyalty to the country, as a general, I have to consider things further. How many rebel soldiers are there in the city? 30,000? Or 50,000? How many people do we have? Even if all of you are good men and first-class warriors, how many nails can you crush even if your whole body is made of iron? If we really go out and risk our lives, even if we don't want our bodies, how many rebel soldiers can we kill? At most, we can kill 1,000 or so. What can we do for the big picture?" After he said that, everyone was speechless. Roar slowly said, "We have been hiding in this place for 3 days. These days, we have been fighting piecemeal, secretly killing off a few stragglers and rebels who ran in. Until now, those idiots have not discovered our presence. This is our chance. At this moment, our strength is weak in the city. Using normal methods to fight the war is no longer possible. If we want to succeed, we need to use a surprise attack. At this time, using an unconventional method is the right way to go. We only have 100 people. If we charge forward in a head-on battle, we will only be able to create a small splash. But, if we run into a special situation, we might be able to change the outcome of the battle if we use this elite force of ours on the edge of the blade. Everyone, Lao Tzu is not afraid of death. Everyone here is not afraid of death. We have no lack of courage to die for the Empire. However, if we really want to save this country, how we die, where we die, when we die, where we die, all of you must listen to me." The logic behind Ruhr's words was clear and no one objected. Since the day the city was breached, Ruhr had gathered more than 100 wounded soldiers of Rodria who were recuperating at home. Taking advantage of the chaos in the city, these over 100 people lurked in this chaotic city. For many days, the city was in chaos and chaos. The rebel army's internal command was in disarray. In order to fight for territory, the rebel army had turned the once bustling imperial capital into a foul atmosphere. The rebel army was not unified. Thus, the mountains and forests naturally gave Ruhr's team a place to hide. What's more, this Fatso was originally known for his ability to run and evade. He was as cunning as an old fox. Although these over 100 men under him were wounded, they were the Rodrir kingdom's elite cavalry. They were warriors who had survived hundreds of battles. Moreover, they were personally trained by him. They had fought together on the battlefield, and after the war, they were raised by him in his home. They were deeply indebted to him, and all of them respected him to the core. Ruhr's every order was obeyed by them. When he commanded them, they were loyal to him, and never had any objections. This group of elites, although all of them were wounded, under the leadership of the clever and cunning Fatso, Ruhr, they were able to carve out a path of survival in this chaotic imperial capital. On the day the city was breached, Ruhr dismissed the servants in his house and distributed the family's wealth. He only brought the 100+ wounded soldiers with him and left the house. Amidst the chaos, they hid in a small alley and hid in an abandoned house. Watching as the rebel army killed their way through the door, Fatso and his men waited patiently. They waited until a dozen rebel soldiers broke into the house. Only then did they take action and slaughter the rebel soldiers who had accidentally walked into the wolf's den. Following that, Ruhr led the selected dozen-plus men and put on the rebel army's uniform. Then, they swaggered out into the streets. The city was filled with rebel soldiers. They burned, killed and looted. Most of them were from different factions. Thus, it was normal for them not to recognize each other. Ruhr and his dozen-plus men rampaged through the streets without anyone stopping them. When the bystanders saw them, they simply thought of them as allies who had run out from the rebel army to take advantage of the burning house. Fatso was extremely daring. He led the dozen-plus men and wandered through the street. He had lived in the imperial capital for a long time and was naturally familiar with the geography. He found several remote locations and set up traps to ambush the rebels. Then, he killed off tens of rebel soldiers who had left the main group. After getting enough clothes, he threw the corpses into the well or tied them to stones and threw them into the river. Only then did he lead his men back to their hiding place. From then on, the 100+ elite soldiers all changed into the rebel army's uniform. Fatso led his men and charged out into the street. If they encountered a large group of rebel soldiers, they would keep a low profile and avoid them. If they encountered a small group of rebel soldiers, they would charge forward and kill them. The city was in chaos. It was common for rebels to fight for territory. Ruhr and his men occasionally fought with the rebels, but they did not attract much attention. Even the day before yesterday, they had attacked a group of more than 100 rebel soldiers. In the end, while they were fighting, 2 more groups of rebel soldiers rushed in from the street. They were caught in the chaos and fought for a long time. In the end, dozens of lives were lost. However, Fatso had already taken advantage of the chaos and escaped with his men. The most daring thing was that when everyone ran out of food, Fatso actually led a dozen men and swaggered into a rebel stronghold on the street. He snatched several bags of food and swaggered away. As for how the rebel army would file a lawsuit after that, it was not Uncle Ruhr's concern. The entire imperial capital was in chaos. Ruhr led his men to hide in the street. He specifically chose rundown houses that had been robbed by the rebels. From the outside, it was obvious that these houses had been emptied. Naturally, no other rebel soldiers would be interested in entering them. Occasionally, when they were hiding, 1 or 2 rebel soldiers would carry women they had kidnapped and barge into the houses. They wanted to do something bad, but they were all slaughtered by Fatso's men. The rescued women had no choice but to be kept in the cellar for now. It had to be said that the Byzantine Empire was facing a national crisis, and the Byzantine Empire that had lived for thousands of years couldn't get any worse. It looked like the Byzantine Empire was about to be destroyed. Everyone's hearts were filled with darkness. They could no longer see a glimmer of hope. However, Fatso had the ability to boost the morale of more than 100 wounded soldiers. Whenever his men looked at this fat general, they could see Fatso smiling indifferently. When he mentioned the rebel army, be it Hughes or Salvatore, they were all a bunch of idiots in Fatso's eyes. It was as if he could poke them to death with a finger. It was this attitude of not being stingy with anything and being a pain in the ass that infected his men. In any case, since the country had already reached this point, he might as well give it his all with this general. As a man, he had nothing else but strength and hot-bloodedness. When it came to the final step, it would be nothing more than closing his eyes, and dying would not be a big deal. The days of hiding in the city had already reached the 5th day. Roer had not slept for almost 2 days. When he had nothing to do, he would quietly climb up to the roof and hide in a leeward area. He would look into the distance and mutter to himself, "They should be there. They should be there." At this moment, the fatty had the same idea as Audiobook. Damn it! Those damn Lantis people. Even if they are crawling like turtles, they should be there by now. The weather is cold and the wind is strong. When the sails of the ships are raised, they will be able to move as if they are flying. Even if those Lantis soldiers in the port of Catania are useless, they will still be able to board the ships after receiving the news. 3 days on the sea is 5 days. They should be there by now. Although Fatso had rejected his men's request to move closer to the Imperial Palace or the Arc de Triomphe, he had been paying attention to the movements in those 2 directions all the time. At the very least, he could still occasionally hear the sound of the Empire's military horn coming from the direction of the Imperial Palace and the Arc de Triomphe. That was enough to prove that those 2 places had not been breached by the rebel army and that his men were still resisting. Lantis. Damn it. Just wait for the Lantis people to arrive. Having not slept for 2 days, Fatso's eyes had become as red as a rabbit's. On this day, he did not eat anything. Whenever he was thirsty, he would grab some snow and swallow it down. In the evening of this day, the sounds of battle coming from the direction of the Arc de Triomphe suddenly became more intense. Looking at it from afar, flames could be seen rising to the sky. Clearly, the rebel army had gathered their forces and were attacking the Arc de Triomph's defenders. After fighting for an entire afternoon, the sound of the military horn had been interrupted several times. Every time the horn stopped, although Fatso did not show it on his face, his heart would be bleeding. Finally, when he heard the sound of the horn again, Fatso secretly breathed a sigh of relief. When the sun had set, Fatso finally came up with a plan. Adrik's side might not be able to hold on for much longer. If worse comes to worst, Lao Tzu will bring these 100 men to save him when the sun rises. My 100 men will be able to kill them from behind and viciously stab the rebel army's buttocks. Sigh, what a pity. Why are those Lantis people taking so long to arrive? As the sky gradually turned dark, the sounds of battle coming from the direction of the Arc de Triomphe had disappeared. The last sound of the military horn had a tragic tone to it, as though it was saying goodbye. Fatso realized that Adrik was truly unable to hold on for much longer. However, just as the curtain of night was about to fall from the direction of the port, accompanied by the cold wind, the faintly discernible sound could be heard. Fatso suddenly felt as though someone had slashed his face with a knife. His bloated body leapt out from the darkness. With a few leaps, he threw himself onto the roof. Perking up his ears, he carefully listened to the wind for a moment. Then, Fatso laughed out wildly. Ha 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 ha! It's here! It's here! It's finally here! Fatso was so excited that tears nearly streamed down his face. Because the horn he heard was the same as the one Adric heard at the Arc de Triomphe, the horn of the Lantis navy. Night had fallen on the sea. On the vast sea, the huge fleet of Lantis navy was lined up in a row. Looking from afar, the shadows of the sails were faintly discernible, densely packed and unending. The huge black hulls of the ships were like fortresses on the sea. This fleet of Lantis navy that came from the port of Catania had been frantically rushing all the way. The sailors on the ships were so tired that they were about to collapse. At this moment, looking at the port from the sea, Osgilla, the most majestic city on the continent, was right before their eyes. In the darkness, this huge city that used to be bustling. However, it was as though there was no life at all. There were no lights in the city. It was dark and stifling to look at. Only on the port there were arrow towers along the coast, and there were lights. Obviously, the soldiers stationed by the rebel army had discovered the fleet of Lantis navy coming from the sea. There was movement in the port, the mobilization of troops and horses, and the emergency horn sounded. In the Lantis navy fleet, the largest warship hung the flag of the flagship. Gislund had already boarded the ship in a small boat. Then, the legendary general of the Lantis navy took over the command of the fleet without hesitation. This fleet that was ordered to come was the second fleet of the navy of the Lantis kingdom. There were 16 giant warships, 8 troop carriers, and more than 30 warships of various sizes. Looking at the sea, it was already a force that the entire navy of the Byzantine Empire could not resist. The flagship was the legendary warship of the navy of the Lantis kingdom, the Divine Walker. Gislund, the bearded general, was the captain of the Divine Walker. Standing on the bridge, Gislund put away the monocular. The sea breeze made his face numb. He turned his head to look at the general behind him, and said in a low voice, "Give the order, the whole army is to disembark immediately." The general behind him was the deputy commander of the fleet. He had led the fleet here from the port of Catania. When he heard Gislund's order, he hesitated and said, "Sir, it's already dark. If we disembark at night, we won't be familiar with the terrain. We will be at a disadvantage. Moreover, we received the news and rushed here with all our might. From the time we boarded the ship to the time we rushed here, we even encountered a storm on the way. All the sailors are exhausted. I don't have a night." Gislund coldly rejected his subordinate's suggestion. He pointed to the city in the distance and said, "The palace is still resisting. But in the following time, the palace could be breached at any moment. Once the palace is lost, it means that all our strategies have failed. I can't take the risk. I can't wait." As he said that, Gislund's face gradually showed an excited expression. "I know we will suffer higher losses than expected. But look carefully. Look at the place in front of us. This is Osgilla, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It's the continent. No, it's the world's most majestic and largest city. And now, this city is right in front of our eyes, right under our feet. We will obtain the greatest achievement in the history of the kingdom, conquering Osgilla. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 458. GOR Chapter 432 The Death of a Man. 3. Following the sound of the bugle horn on the flagship, Lantis's fleet responded back and forth. The entire fleet immediately began to move. Several small assault ships had already moved to the forefront of the fleet. They circled around Heti and sped toward the port. Before dawn, I want the feet of my soldiers standing on Osgila's beach. Gislund coldly gave the order. The battle on the sea began with the roar of the ballista cannons. At the port of Osgiria, the huge archery towers that were built along the coastline and mountains were the coastal defense system that the Byzantine Empire built with the resources of several generations. They were built to deal with the invincible fleet of the Lantis kingdom, and they thought that the Byzantine Empire would be their enemy. The arrow towers in the forest were equipped with a large number of heavy ballistas and small catapult. On the sea, 2 seawaters blocked the estuary of the port, leaving only a narrow estuary for ships to pass through. Once an enemy ship broke through, the dense concentration of ballista cannons on the port's arrow towers would completely cover the narrow estuary. The rebel army had not occupied the coastal defense fortifications for long, and the rebel army had not had enough time to familiarize themselves with the ballista cannons and coastal defense operations. However, the coastal defense fortifications of the port had been in operation for many years. The ballista cannons and catapults had already been adjusted and aimed. When firing, there was no need to deliberately aim, all they had to do was fire at the narrow estuary. As soon as Lantis's 2 medium-sized assault ships broke through the estuary, they were immediately bombarded by the dense concentration of ballista cannons on the port's defensive fortifications. The huge ballista cannons were made of thick ballista spears. There were even some hammer cannons with chains attached to them. Once the ballista cannons hit the main mast of the ship, the mast would immediately be smashed apart. The entry of the 2 assault ships took only a quarter of an hour. One of the assault ships had its main mast broken, and it swayed to the side. Countless small boats were lowered from the large ship. Lantis's navy began to row the small boats toward the coast. On top of the arrow towers, the archers began to move. A dense rain of arrows rained down on the sea. The Lantis had to pay a considerable price to advance. They had to put down their small boat. Under the concentrated attacks of the crossbows on the coast, Lantis soldiers were injured or killed every moment. Although the Lantis soldiers had already raised their shields to resist, the whistling sound of the giant crossbows and flail hammers could smash the small boats into the sea with just one hit. In the distance, Lantis's battleship finally got into position. The hull of the battleship was in a horizontal line, and the ballista on the battleship began to fire back. The Lantis navy was unrivaled in the world. Their warship's craftsmanship was far superior to that of Byzantium. The ballista cannons on the ships had a longer range and greater power. The counterattack of more than 10 giant battleships was aimed at the arrow towers on the shore. The whistling sound of the ballista and flail hammers kept coming back and forth above the heads of both sides. Lantis's people sent several assault ships and lowered hundreds of small boats, but they were still unable to break through the estuary. Although the attack of the fleet had already caused the arrow towers on the shore to suffer a lot of damage, 2 arrow towers were even hit by the ballista and flail hammers of the navy in the chaotic battle, causing stone fragments to fly everywhere. However, the determination of the rebel army to resist was very strong. They stubbornly defended the coastline and refused to retreat even a step. The ships came and went, and the assault ships were densely spread out on the sea surface. Standing on the bridge of the Divine Walker, looking at the sea of blood in front of him, Gislund's expression was hard and cold. It really is a very good defense system. Gislund listened to the shouts and screams of the soldiers, listened to the roar of the ballista, but suddenly looked back and glanced at the several deputy generals behind him. He said lightly, "When we were at home, we always heard about Osgila's coastal defense system. We did countless deductions ourselves. If one day I lead a fleet to attack this city, what should we do? Gentlemen, right now, this fact has already happened in front of us. This city's coastal defense is indeed very tight, but I believe that Lantis navy is truly invincible. No matter how strong a shield is, it is impossible to suppress a sharp spear and a sharp sword. Pass down the order." The war drums don't stop, the bugles don't stop. I'm going to use this attack to destroy this so-called most secure coastal defense system. Even if the war is over, I will let the Byzantium know that their so-called coastal defense system, which regards us as an imaginary enemy, is not worth mentioning at all. Gentlemen, the significance of this battle is not only in the present, but also in the future. Keep up. Quick, quick, quick. The movement in the direction of the sea had completely awakened Osgilla in the night. On the streets near the harbor, the rebel army was nervously gathering and mobilizing. Some desperately ran from the harbor to the city, while others began to gather their men and horses towards the harbor. Rebel troops came and went on the street. At night, especially in this cold winter, except for Hughes and Salvatore's men who still insisted on attacking the palace and the Arc de Triomphe, the other rebel forces seemed to have lost their initiative. For the past few days, they had already robbed their fill. In this kind of cold weather, everyone was more than willing to stay in the houses of the rich people that they had occupied, drink wine, and hug the girls that they had snatched. After entering the city, the level of chaos among the rebel army made even Salvatore and Hughes so angry that they vomited blood. No one expected Lantis men to come so quickly and so resolutely. Many people even thought that after the fall of the capital, Lantis men would give up their previous position. What followed next was nothing more than the end of the war. When they broke into the palace and announced the official destruction of the Byzantine Empire, they could sit at the table and negotiate with Lantis men to end the war. Who would believe that Lantis men would take the risk to come to the rescue when Osgilla city had been conquered? If the Byzantine Empire was still around, the Lantis Empire would definitely try to take advantage of it. However, the Byzantine Empire was already destroyed and 99% of the Byzantine Empire was gone. Therefore, the Lantis Empire wouldn't try to take advantage of the situation. This thought was shared by all the factions within the rebel army. Even Hughes and Salvatore, although they were worried about Lantis movements, could not do anything about this situation. Among the two of them, Salvatore's prestige had hit rock bottom because of what had happened previously. Hughes, on the other hand, had suffered great losses from the bloody battle that night when Rodrier's cavalry attacked the city. The two leaders of the rebel army were unable to control the situation. Although there were many rebels, the two of them were unable to command them. When the sound of the sea rang out outside the palace, Hughes, who was lecturing the generals in the tent, suddenly rushed out with a crazed expression. He looked in the direction of the sea and was stunned for a moment. This aristocratic governor immediately went crazy with a twisted expression. "Pass down the order. All troops attack. At all costs. We must break into the palace immediately. Bastard! Bastard! Get those bastards to rise!" In the direction of the Arc de Triomphe, Salvatore naturally heard the commotion on the sea. But his reaction was different from Hughes. When the commotion came from the sea, Salvatore did not seem to be too agitated. He simply sat on his horse and looked in the direction of the sea. Then, he sighed deeply. Salvatore was not young to begin with. At that moment, he appeared to have aged by 10 years. He gritted his teeth and muttered to himself. Missed it is missed. Sigh, what a pity, what a good opportunity. He turned his head and looked in the direction of the Arc de Triomphe. He suddenly smiled bitterly. Adric, you were waiting for this moment, right? The old man pulled himself together and suddenly gave the order. All troops turn around. We will not attack the Arc de Triomphe. All troops advance toward the palace. We will join forces with Governor Hughes. Attack the palace with all our might. Hurry! Lantis men have arrived. We must take advantage of the fact that they have yet to reach the shore to break into the palace and destroy Byzantium. Only then will we have a chance to survive. Originally, the entire army had already gathered up and was prepared to attack the Arc de Triomphe at the last moment of darkness. Having fought to this point, Everyone knew that no matter how tough the fellows from the Arc de Triomphe were, they had reached their limit. Perhaps one more charge would be enough to defeat them. However, Salvatore suddenly changed the order. All the rebel soldiers could only obey the order. The entire army fell into formation and turned around. Naturally, the sudden movement of such a large number of soldiers would not be quick enough. Chaos would ensue for a moment. Salvatore gave the order again and again, and the order was quickly passed down to the various ranks of the army. The rear of the army had already begun moving. However, at that moment, the sound of battle could suddenly be heard coming from the direction of the Arc de Triomphe. Salvatore's face sank, and one of his subordinates quickly came forward to report the situation. "Sir Governor, the Arc de Triomphe. The soldiers defending the Arc de Triomphe have suddenly abandoned their camp and charged out. The army behind them has already engaged them." Salvatore's face sank. Seated on his horse, he shuddered. Then, he took a deep breath. "Good. What a good Adric. He is truly ruthless. To charge out at this time, he wants to hold me down and prevent me from helping Hughes attack the palace." Salvatore's mind raced through several thoughts in an instant. Finally, he gritted his teeth and shouted, "Order the rear to resist. The front troops continue to advance. We go to the palace." Hearing that, the faces of his subordinates changed and they shouted, "Sir." Auderic had exhausted all his strength. "Since they have left their camp, we can turn back and attack. In less than 2 to 4 hours we can kill them all. After fighting for so many days and losing so many people, this is the last chance to destroy the enemy." Salvatore's face was fierce and he suddenly shouted, "Idiots! A bunch of idiots! Do you still not understand? 2 to 4 hours. Where do I get 2 to 4 hours? If we wait for Lantis men to come ashore, even if we kill all of Adric's men, it will be a waste of effort. The palace? Only by breaking into the palace now will we have a chance of survival. Order the rear to resist. All troops to the palace. Hurry! Hurry!" Roar shouted loudly. The 100 soldiers behind him all lined up and ran quickly behind him. On the main street, Roar led more than 100 men and swaggered in the direction of the port. They were wearing the armor of the rebel army. At that moment there were dozens of rebel army groups in the city. In the chaos of war, who could tell which group they belonged to? The battle in the port area had begun and the rebel army along the way had been alerted. Some of them had gathered in the port area while others had retreated. The people coming and going on the streets were all wearing the armor of the rebel army. Fatso led his men and swaggered along the way and no one stopped him. Finally, when they reached a street outside the port area, they finally encountered a checkpoint. The rebel army blocking the road was about to stop them when Roar ran in front. He stared and shouted loudly, "Under the orders of Governor Hughes, we are to reinforce the port area." Hearing that, the rebel army blocking the road made way for them. The large port area used to be the gathering place for the Empire's maritime trade. Now that the city had fallen, the huge market of the past was empty. The battle at the port area was in full swing and the rebel army coming and going were in a mess. When Fatty's group of over 100 people rushed in, no one spared a second glance at this small group of people. "Leave 10 men behind." Fatso gritted his teeth and said, "Go to the warehouse at the port and set fire to it. Create chaos. The bigger the commotion, the better. When we encounter the rebel army, there is no need to fight them. Just one goal: set fire and create chaos. Let them fall into chaos." Immediately, a few men accepted the order and quickly picked people out. Then, they scattered in all directions. "The rest of you, follow me to the port area. First, take down an arrow tower." Fatso held his sword horizontally and suddenly laughed bitterly. "Damn it! The coastal defense system of this port was built by us to deal with the Lantis fleet. Today we have to help the Lantis break our own coastal defense. Thinking about it carefully, this feeling is a little damn." More than an hour had passed since the fierce battle began. The Lantis navy was still bleeding profusely. The sea near the beach had long become a sea of blood. Many of the Lantis assault boats had been overturned and were floating on the sea. There were also the corpses of the Lantis soldiers who had been killed by arrows floating on the sea. They were swept up by the waves and some of them had already drifted to the beach. The arrow towers on both sides were still roaring, and the ballistas and chain hammers were desperately bombarding in the direction of the estuary. The Lantis fleet had already mobilized several assault boats, which were specially built ships. The hull of the assault boats was covered with iron armor. They were the special ships used to attack or ram enemy ships at sea. At this moment, they had rushed into the estuary. Under the tight defense of the coastal defense fortifications, 3 of the Lantis assault boats had been directly sunk, and one of them had its mast smashed. They could not advance or retreat and lay horizontally on the sea at the estuary. Giselund was still in command on the Divine Walker. Seeing his fleet bleeding and suffering huge losses, the Lantis Navy general's expression did not change. He just passed down orders one by one. The fleet was frequently mobilized, and the 2 wings of the fleet continued to use ballistas to suppress the coastal defense arrow towers on the shore. The assault boats were constantly sent up to land. There was no room for tricks in this kind of landing battle. It was a battle of lives and the mental fortitude of each other's commanders. They won't be able to hold on for long. Giselund even had room to discuss with his subordinates. These rebels are not real navies. They are not familiar with this coastal defense, and cannot fully utilize these fortifications to their maximum effect. Moreover, the rebels are not internally united. As long as we press forward and put pressure on them, they will collapse sooner or later. We will definitely be able to land before dawn. A deputy general behind him sighed in a low voice. My lord, the casualties are all our Lantis soldiers. We are fighting for the Byzantium, and the casualties are our people. I still don't understand. Giselund smiled and did not get angry. He looked at his subordinate and said lightly, even if you don't understand, you don't need to think about it. These things, you don't need to think about it. This overall situation has always been in the hearts of His Highness and I. Winning this war will be the greatest harvest of the Empire in the past few hundred years. Everyone, fight. After a pause, Giselund suddenly said, Where is His Highness? Someone beside him said, After His Highness boarded the ship, he went to the cabin to rest. It seems that he has no interest in coming to the bridge to watch the battle. A while ago, my lord sent me to invite His Highness. His Highness only said that my lord is in command of this battle. He only needs to rest in the cabin and wait for the news of victory. Giselund's heart moved as he thought, this His Highness is really a wise ruler. He doesn't use power in battle and doesn't compete with the commander. He knows when to advance and retreat. This is very rare. Conquering Osgilla, what kind of peerless achievement is this? This young His Highness is not greedy for the limelight. He deliberately retreated, and let me enjoy this great achievement alone. I am a powerful figure in the Navy, so I naturally accept his kindness. In the future, when His Highness inherits the throne, I will naturally do my best to repay this kindness. His Highness' intelligence is admirable. Looking at the battle on the sea, Giselund's heart suddenly felt carefree. The luck of the 3 great powers has always been the mainland countries fighting for power. Our Lantis people are just a foil. But now the Odin people are barbaric and don't know civilization. Even if they have enough destructive power, they don't know how to manage and build. Byzantium has always been the largest empire of human beings, but now the country is suffering from internal and external problems. The fate of the country can be considered to have come to an end. Lantis has a wise ruler and a group of wise ministers and generals. The fate of the country will eventually fall on Lantis. Just as Giselund was daydreaming, he suddenly heard a general beside him exclaim, My lord! Look! As soon as Gislund turned his head, someone stuffed a monocular into his hand. Gislund looked over and saw an arrow tower on the coast, bursting into flames. In the darkness, the huge arrow tower seemed to have turned into a huge pillar of fire. The flames soared into the sky, looking very dazzling. What's going on? Gislund was surprised and delighted. I don't know. As we were fighting, the arrow tower suddenly burst into flames. It wasn't our ballista either. Next, something even stranger happened. On the coast, another arrow tower suddenly appeared. The ballista that was originally firing at the sea suddenly turned around and fired at their own arrow tower not far away. 3 consecutive ballista shots directly shattered the top of the arrow tower next to them. For a moment, the harbor beach was in chaos. In the midst of the chaos, the rebel army's horn could be heard coming from the dock. When Gislund heard it, his face suddenly became strange. Did you hear it clearly? Seems to be. Brag. Brag to Lao Tzu as much as you can. Fatso's face was covered in blood as he stood on the arrow tower with his blade held horizontally. Below the steps was a scene of chaos. His elite subordinates were guarding the steps of the stairs. The rebel army below reacted and wanted to attack and seize the arrow tower again, but they were all suppressed by his men at the bottom of the stairs. The stairs were narrow and the steps were only a square inch in size. No matter how many people there were, they would not be able to fill it. In this small situation, Rohr's subordinates were all veterans of hundreds of battles. One man could hold the pass against 10,000 men. They firmly guarded the steps of the arrow tower, and the hundreds of rebel soldiers below were unable to break through. Rohr, who was standing at the top of the steps, casually picked up 2 stones and threw them down the step. Immediately, several muffled sounds and miserable screams could be heard. Keep blowing! Don't stop! Ha 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 ha! Beside him, one of his subordinates was holding on to a rebel army's horn that he had snatched from who knows where and was blowing it with all his might. That bugle was the tune of the rebel army's bugle call, but this tune was clearly the bugle call for retreat. After fighting for 2 hours, they saw that although Lantis's navy had suffered a lot of damage, they were still closing in step by step. The black mass of the fleet lay across the sea, and the densely packed boats were lowered. No one knew how many there were. After holding on for such a long time, the rebel army was terrified. They were originally fighting in a hurry, and had not been guarding the coastal defense system for long. There was really no cooperation between them to speak of. At this moment, in the midst of the chaotic battle, they suddenly heard the bugle call for their own army to retreat. This time, the rebel army was really in chaos. In some of the arrow towers, the defenders had long lost the will to resist. When they heard the bugle call, they hurriedly rushed down the tower and ran away. Some were confused and did not know what was going on. For a moment, in the arrow towers of the coastal defense, the roar of the ballistae seemed to have slowed down. As the rebel army was looking at each other, the general in charge of the coastal defense furiously dispatched his men to figure out what was going on. The several warehouses on the pier were originally abandoned places. The supplies inside had long been looted and moved away by the rebel army. Naturally, there was no one left to guard the abandoned warehouses. However, when night fell, several of the warehouses suddenly burst into flames. For a moment, the flames on the pier soared to the sky and rebel soldiers ran around like headless flies. The orders given were unclear and the orders given were unclear. The soldiers did not know their generals and the generals did not know their subordinate. People were running around chaotically. Some were busy putting out the fires, some were busy searching for the culprits who set the fires, some were rushing to the arrow towers to provide assistance, and some had retreated after hearing the bugle call for retreat. Just like that, countless people got mixed up together. Out in the sea, Gislund put down the telescope in his hand and suddenly smiled. Ha! It seems this must be the handiwork of some of our old friends in the city. We can't let such good intentions go to waste. Pass down the order, the assault ships are to get up there. Take down this port is right before us. 2 updates, 11,000 words, today can be considered as a great day. To be continued, if you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.